In every century, there are souls whose devotion eclipses reason, whose love becomes faith, and whose faith consumes everything human within them. Magda Goebbels lived not merely in history but inside the fever of belief itself, a woman who sought meaning in destruction and salvation in loyalty to a doomed dream. Welcome, dear listener, to Biography Files Docs. Tell us where and when you're listening from. Join our circle of memory and subscribe to keep these stories alive. The night is silent in Wilmersdorf. A girl lies awake, her small body caught between the warmth of the blanket and the chill of a world collapsing beyond the walls. Outside, Berlin is still imperial in name, but its heart is faltering, the air heavy with the murmurs of a nation that has lost its certainty. The year is 1901, and in this uneasy calm, Johanna Maria Magdalena Behrend is born. Magda, as she will later be known. No one in that quiet room could foresee that this infant would one day stand at the center of a darkness that reshaped the world. Her early years unfold like a faded photograph, the distant echo of marching bands from Kaiser Wilhelm's parades, the soft rustle of her mother's dress, the smell of starch and soap. Her parents' marriage, fragile from the beginning, fractures before she is old enough to understand the meaning of absence. Her father, Oskar Behrend, a modest engineer with dreams larger than his means, leaves early. Her mother, Auguste, must navigate life alone, carrying both pride and bitterness like invisible luggage. Magda learns early that affection is conditional, that love is often transactional. The absence of her father becomes a silent script she will carry for decades, an endless search for authority to replace affection, for purpose to fill the gaps of tenderness. There is an ache in her, not yet named, a longing for something vast, orderly, eternal. Perhaps it begins here, the desire to belong to something that will never leave her. In the rooms of her childhood home, crosses hang beside portraits of soldiers. Discipline is not cruelty but structure, and structure becomes her safety. She listens to her mother speak of propriety, of how a woman must bear herself in an uncertain world. The Prussian spirit still breathes in those walls, silent endurance, obedience, reverence for hierarchy. For Magda, this becomes not a burden, but a promise, that through order, the chaos inside her might one day be calmed. When the Great War breaks out in 1914, she is 13. Berlin shifts from grandeur to hunger almost overnight. The boys she knows march away in uniforms that make them seem taller, older, immortal. Her school lessons are interrupted by sirens and scarcity. The city becomes a landscape of endurance. Magda watches the mothers on the streets clutch ration cards like sacred texts, their faces pale with fatigue and pride. From them, she learns that suffering can be worn as virtue. It is a dangerous lesson, one that will one day shape her understanding of loyalty. In these years, her sense of belonging fractures further. Her mother remarries, a Jewish businessman named Richard Friedlander. He is kind, educated, and tries to offer the girl something of the father she lost. But Magda is restless, caught between two worlds. In the Berlin of the 1920s, identity is fluid, uncertain. She is half drawn to Friedlander's cosmopolitan gentleness, half repelled by it, perhaps already sensing how difference will one day become a weapon. She moves between religious influences, Catholic convent education, Protestant teachers, and whispers of mysticism that sweep through post-war Germany. Everywhere she looks, someone is searching for meaning amid ruin. Those who later write of her often describe her as beautiful, composed, magnetic. But beauty, in her case, was never just surface. It was performance, an armor forged early. The small girl who once sat silently at the dinner table, watching her parents' resentment turn into ritual, now learns how to smile without revealing emotion. Control becomes grace. It is in this poise that others will one day see both elegance and fanaticism. The armistice comes. Germany's empire dissolves. The Kaiser flees. The world she was taught to revere collapses in humiliation. For Magda, who has never belonged entirely to any one faith or family, the collapse feels strangely personal. The symbols she once clung to, flags, prayers, ceremonies, suddenly seem hollow. And yet within this emptiness she begins to dream of a new order, a rebirth. Years later, in her letters and recollections, there are traces of nostalgia for this time, not for its suffering, but for the purity of longing it carried, the longing to believe, to devote, to surrender oneself completely to something greater. It is a dangerous form of innocence, one that blurs into fanaticism before one even notices the shift. By her late teens, she walks the streets of Berlin with quiet confidence. She has learned how to listen more than she speaks. The city around her pulses with jazz, politics, and decay. Men in tattered uniforms argue about Marx and Versailles. Women wear modern skirts and old grief. Somewhere between the cabarets and the church bells, Magda senses the birth of something immense and unseen, a hunger for order disguised as hope. At night she reads mystical texts, patriotic pamphlets, and novels filled with heroic suffering. Words become her escape, but also her education. She begins to imagine herself not merely as a woman, but as an instrument of destiny. If her childhood was about survival, her youth becomes about purpose. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true, of the young Magda sitting in her stepfather's office, fingers tracing the metal type used for printing business cards. She watches the letters align, each symbol small and precise, forming names, meanings, identities. The smell of ink fills the air, sharp, metallic, unforgettable. She later recalls it in her writings as the scent of creation, of words shaping worlds. Yet one cannot help but wonder if, somewhere deep inside, she already sensed how those same letters could become weapons. The world outside continues to unravel. Inflation devours savings, soldiers beg on corners, and extremist voices echo through the beer halls. Amid the noise, Magda remains quiet, observant. She is not yet a believer, but the ground within her is being prepared. The chaos of the streets mirrors the chaos of her own disordered longing, and soon someone will come, offering both meaning and love. For now, though, she's only a girl, watching, waiting, listening. The cross on the wall above her bed catches the last light of evening. Its shadow stretches across the floor like a compass, pointing toward her future. The metallic smell of ink lingered in her mind long after she left the room, the memory of order and permanence, of words locked into place by will and intention. It was, perhaps, the first time Magda Goebbels sensed that power could be made visible, shaped into lines, printed and multiplied. Yet as she stepped into adulthood, the clarity she yearned for dissolved again into the ambiguity of the Weimar world. Germany was a country suspended between eras, trembling between guilt and pride, chaos and yearning. For a generation born into the promise of empire and awakening into defeat, the search for direction became an ache that would not relent. Magda's life began to mirror that national condition, refined, disciplined, yet perpetually unsatisfied, haunted by the sense that meaning was always just out of reach. In the early 1920s, she was a young woman of charm and precision, educated in a Catholic convent where discipline had been both a comfort and a cage. The nuns had taught her the virtue of silence, of measured gestures and modesty, and from them she learned to associate order with holiness. She carried that bearing into the salons and tea rooms of post-war Berlin, where young people spoke feverishly of democracy and art, of freedom and modernity. She listened politely, but something in her resisted the looseness of it all. The laughter, the jazz, the bright colors of the new republic. It all seemed too loud, too transient. Beneath the noise, she felt an emptiness, as though the entire nation had lost its soul and was trying to disguise the loss with feverish pleasure. Her marriage to the industrialist Günther Quandt appeared, at first glance, to offer escape from the uncertainties of the time. Quandt was wealthy, respected, a man of industry whose name opened doors to stability. Magda was 20 when they met, poised and graceful, her beauty dignified rather than flamboyant. He was 17 years older, cautious, emotionally distant, drawn perhaps to the calm surface she projected. Their union was not born of love so much as of mutual utility. He offered protection and prestige. She offered elegance and composure. For a time, she played her role with precision, learning the codes of the upper class, the dinner parties, the charities, the careful avoidance of public emotion. Yet inside, a restlessness grew. The great houses of post-war industry were built upon silence, the kind that smothered both guilt and curiosity. Magda, accustomed to the rhythm of austerity, now found herself surrounded by marble floors, servants who bowed, and rooms large enough to echo. The air was perfumed with comfort, but it left her uneasy. She had married safety, but safety had no pulse. She bore a son, Harold, in 1921, and for a brief time the world narrowed into something tender, almost sacred. But even motherhood could not quell the feeling that she was living someone else's life. She looked at her husband and saw not malice, but absence. A man absorbed in his ledgers and factories, measuring life in profits and losses. She was meant to be grateful, and for a while she was. Then came the slow, dawning realization that her hunger was not for wealth, but for meaning. The marriage began to crack under the strain of unspoken discontent. Quandt was often away, and Magda, left to her own devices, began to explore new circles of thought. She attended lectures, read philosophy, and drifted toward gatherings where politics and mysticism intertwined. The air of the time was electric with confusion. Everyone spoke of destiny, rebirth, and purification. Nationalism was not yet the monster it would become. It still masqueraded as poetry, as a promise to restore dignity to a humiliated people. Magda was drawn to that language, to the sense that one could belong to something greater, something eternal. Her fascination with the mystical grew in those years. She read theosophical works, dabbled in Eastern spiritualism, and visited astrologers who spoke of planetary alignments and the fate of nations. It was not mere superstition. It was the same yearning that had once made her trace the cross on her bedroom wall as a child. She was searching for order, for design, for the invisible architecture of purpose. In one letter, she wrote that Germany is sick, not with hunger, but with disbelief, a phrase that seems to capture her state of mind as much as her nation's. By the mid-1920s, her marriage had become little more than a polite arrangement. Quandt, pragmatic as ever, agreed to a separation. Magda kept her dignity, her name, and the custody of her son. Yet the dissolution of her marriage, rather than liberating her, seemed to deepen her hunger for structure. Divorce, in her world, carried the scent of failure. She was still young, still admired, but her life had begun to drift without a clear center. She returned to Berlin, now a city of sharp contrasts, poverty and decadence, intellectual brilliance and moral exhaustion. The streets pulsed with politics. Every cafe seemed to hold a new ideology. It was in this restless city that she would soon encounter the force that would define her existence. The years between 1926 and 1930 were the threshold of her transformation. Magda became involved with a small but fervent group of nationalists who spoke not only of politics, but of salvation. They saw Germany not as a nation, but as a soul in exile. Their language was mystical, moral, almost religious. She was captivated, not only by their words, but by their conviction. It was conviction she had longed for all her life, a faith that asked everything and offered clarity in return. She began to attend rallies, modest at first, then larger. The symbols, the uniforms, the chants. They stirred something ancient within her, the echo of the order she had once found in the convent and lost in the chaos of freedom. Among those who noticed her presence at these gatherings was a man whose charisma thrived on recognition. His name was Joseph Goebbels. At that time, he was still a rising propagandist, a speaker whose words burned with resentment and poetry. Their meeting was not yet personal, but there was a spark, a recognition of shared hunger. Magda, elegant and composed, saw in him a fire she had never found in her husband. Goebbels, wounded and ambitious, saw in her the embodiment of the ideal he preached: purity, devotion, and the disciplined beauty of belief. But that encounter was still to come. For now, Magda walked home through the cold Berlin night, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, the city alive with the restless hum of an age that did not yet know its direction. Above her, the moon hung like a pale coin, indifferent and watchful. She paused for a moment beneath a street lamp, the glow falling over her gloved hands. She thought perhaps of her son sleeping at home, of the silence awaiting her, of the cross that still hung in her room. Somewhere far off, the wind carried the faint rhythm of a marching song, barely audible, but insistent. It was the sound of something awakening, a force that promised order in exchange for surrender, belonging in exchange for self. And as the light flickered over her face, the metallic scent of type and ink seemed to return to her, mingling with the smoke of the city. It was the smell of words taking shape, of destinies being printed line by line, even before they were fully written. The smoke from Berlin's chimneys seemed thicker that winter, the air damp with coal and anxiety. It was 1929, and the streets trembled with a strange expectancy, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Magda, now in her late 20s, walked among its shifting moods with a calm that drew attention. She had returned from the quiet corridors of her former marriage into a world that was cracking open, raw with contradiction. Cafes buzzed with artists who mocked authority and dreamers who worshipped it. Soldiers without wars haunted the corners, still wearing fragments of their uniforms. Somewhere between them all, Magda moved like a figure searching for her reflection in a broken mirror. She belonged to no party, no faith, no man, but within her grew the desire for a cause that could bind all fractures into one unbroken vision. In those restless months, she reconnected with an old acquaintance who invited her to a political meeting in the Sportpalast. She accepted with polite curiosity, expecting little more than another evening of fiery speeches. Yet as she entered the hall and the lights dimmed, something caught her unprepared. The crowd's energy seemed to vibrate through the floor, a wave of faith disguised as fury. And then came the voice, measured, hypnotic, urgent. Adolf Hitler spoke not to the mind, but to the emptiness within people, to the bruised dignity of a nation that no longer knew how to forgive itself. Magda listened, frozen, as his words wove order from chaos, offering a moral universe with clean lines, certainties, and enemies to blame. She left the hall shaken, not yet devoted, but marked by the memory of collective ecstasy. It was not the speech itself that haunted her, but the silence that followed, the hush of thousands breathing together, waiting, united in a single emotion. She had felt that same unity once before in church as a girl, when the congregation bowed their heads in unison. It was the sensation of surrender, of release from doubt. Walking home that night, she sensed that history was beginning to breathe again, though she could not yet name the cost. In her diary, she wrote only, "They make belief seem possible again." A few weeks later, she attended a smaller gathering, one organized by Joseph Goebbels, then the rising Gauleiter of Berlin. His reputation preceded him. a master of words, an architect of emotion, a man who could transform despair into weaponized hope. He was shorter than she expected, pale, with eyes that never seemed to rest. When he spoke, it was as though the room bent toward him. He talked not of policy, but of destiny, of purity, of rebirth. His sentences rose and fell like music. Magda felt as if she had met someone who could articulate the inchoate longing she carried since childhood, the desire for something absolute, invulnerable to doubt. Their first conversation was brief. He noticed her immediately, as he noticed everyone worth noticing, but her poise unsettled him. She was neither deferential nor flirtatious. When he asked what she thought of his speech, she replied softly, "You speak as if words could heal the dead." He smiled, uncertain whether she meant it as praise or irony. That ambiguity drew him to her. For Magda, the attraction was slower, more perilous. Goebbels was unlike anyone she had known, brilliant, wounded, theatrical, and utterly convinced of his mission. He seemed to live suspended between genius and hysteria, and in that intensity she sensed both danger and salvation. As their acquaintance deepened, Berlin seemed to shrink around them, its noise receding into a background hum. They met often in cafes where political workers gathered, and later in the quieter spaces of Goebbels' office. He spoke to her about the movement, about Hitler's vision, about the moral rebirth of Germany. She listened, asking questions, her eyes steady. What fascinated her was not the hatred, but the order beneath it, the sense of purpose that lent every cruelty a logic. Goebbels, sensing her intelligence, began to confide in her, to test his ideas aloud, to polish phrases that would later become slogans. She became both muse and mirror, the calm presence that reflected his chaos without judgment. In these months, their emotional bond deepened into something neither could name. It was not quite love, perhaps something more intoxicating, more dangerous. He needed adoration, and she needed to give meaning. In him, she found the same paradox she had always sought: passion wrapped in discipline, sin cloaked in sanctity. For her, this relationship was not merely personal, it was symbolic, almost mythic. Joseph represented the movement, the cause, the destiny that Germany itself seemed to whisper to her in her sleepless nights. To love him was to love the order that history promised to restore. When she was introduced to Adolf Hitler through Goebbels, she felt the same reverence she once felt before an altar. The encounter was formal, brief, yet unforgettable. Hitler's voice, softer in private than in his public speeches, carried an odd gentleness that disarmed her. He complimented her composure, saying she had the spirit of an old Prussian mother. The words struck her deeply, for they framed her not as a woman, but as an ideal. In that moment, something shifted within her. She no longer saw herself as merely Magda Berend or Magda Quant, but as a vessel of something eternal, a figure that could embody an entire nation's yearning. It was, perhaps, the moment when her private identity began to dissolve into myth. The following months unfolded like the slow tightening of a knot. She and Goebbels became inseparable, though their relationship burned in secret at first. She admired his devotion to Hitler, his tireless work, his capacity for persuasion. But she also saw his fragility, the insecurity masked by rhetoric, the jealousy beneath the charm. There were nights when he confessed his doubts, when his words broke into fragments of despair. Magda listened, soothed, believed. She had once sought strength in others, but now she began to see her own strength reflected in his need for her faith. It was intoxicating to be indispensable to a man whose words could move thousands. In 1931, Goebbels' political influence grew rapidly, and so did his ambition. Yet he remained emotionally volatile, prone to outbursts and moments of despair. Magda's calm became his anchor. When rumors of their affair reached the inner circles of the party, Hitler himself intervened. The Führer, ever conscious of appearances, saw in Magda something pure and symbolic, an ideal companion for his minister of propaganda. He encouraged their union, framing it as a political and moral alliance. Magda accepted without hesitation. For her, this was not merely marriage, it was consecration. Their wedding, held in December 1931, was attended by Hitler, who stood as witness. The ceremony felt less like a private celebration and more like a ritual dedication to a cause. As the vows were spoken, Magda's gaze lingered on the leader whose approval had sanctified her fate. She wore white, but it was not innocence that the color suggested, it was sacrifice. In photographs from that day, she appears serene, luminous, her eyes distant. She had entered the orbit of history, and she would never escape it again. That evening, as she and Joseph stood at the balcony of their new home, the city stretched before them, restless and waiting. The torches of a nighttime rally glimmered in the distance, reflected faintly in her eyes. She felt both exhilaration and unease, as though standing at the threshold of something immense and irreversible. Beneath the distant roar of chants, she could almost hear the faint click of type, the rhythm of propaganda already being set into motion, line by line, word by word, like destiny itself being printed onto the world. The night after their wedding, the city lay beneath a pale frost. From their window, the glow of the torches had faded, but the echo of the chant still seemed to vibrate faintly through the air. Magda stood at the glass while Joseph paced behind her, restless, already thinking of speeches, strategies, the next day's newspapers. Marriage, for him, was not an ending but an extension of the campaign, another layer of performance. For Magda, it was something closer to transcendence. She had crossed from the world of personal uncertainties into the sphere of destiny. The ceremony had bound her not only to a man, but to an idea, and in that surrender she found a strange calm. She was now part of something eternal, or so she believed. In the early years of the 1930s, as the National Socialist movement rose with alarming momentum, the Goebbels household became both sanctuary and stage. Magda learned her new role quickly. She appeared at public events with quiet elegance, never ostentatious but always composed, her gestures precise, her voice low. In a world dominated by shouting men, her restraint became a form of power. The newspapers called her the model of German womanhood, cultured, faithful, disciplined. She smiled at the praise but understood that it was also a cage. Her image was being shaped into myth, her individuality dissolved into an emblem of virtue. The transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible, and yet it was absolute. Joseph, intoxicated by proximity to power, demanded both devotion and understanding. He was tireless, writing speeches late into the night, his hands ink-stained, his moods oscillating between exultation and despair. When his political ambitions faltered, he raged against enemies real and imagined. When they succeeded, he was radiant with purpose. Magda learned to read these storms, to quiet them not with argument, but with presence. She saw herself as the calm behind the curtain, the fixed point around which his chaos could revolve. To others, she appeared submissive. To herself, she was serving a higher form of control, the quiet mastery of sustaining belief. Hitler's visits to their home added another layer of reverence. He would arrive unannounced, often in the evenings, surrounded by guards and silence. Magda greeted him with the same composure she would have offered a monarch. His manner was strangely domestic, at times almost paternal. He adored her children as symbols of German purity, and the Goebbels home became one of his few refugees from the political storm. Around the dinner table, conversation flowed in cautious reverence. Magda listened more than she spoke, her face an unreadable mask of serenity. Yet inside she felt both awe and unease. Hitler's presence carried a gravity that distorted the air. He spoke of destiny as though he had glimpsed its architecture, and everyone around him felt smaller in its shadow. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, Berlin transformed overnight. Flags multiplied on every facade, uniforms filled the streets, and the language of ordinary life was replaced by the cadence of slogans. Magda moved through this metamorphosis like a figure already accustomed to ritual. Her household became the mirror of the new regime, ordered, immaculate, full of children, faith, and discipline. She bore 6 in total, daughters and sons named after virtues and heroes. Their laughter filled the halls of their lakeside villa, yet even there, every gesture carried symbolic weight. The Goebbels children were not merely a family, they were propaganda incarnate, a living portrait of Aryan perfection. In public, Magda was the radiant matron of the Third Reich, praised by women's magazines and adored by citizens who saw in her the motherly face of the nation. She visited hospitals, spoke softly to soldiers' wives, attended rallies where the air shimmered with collective faith. Yet beneath the polished surface, she felt the slow tightening of fate. Her marriage, which had begun in reverence, grew more complicated as Joseph's infidelities became impossible to ignore. His charisma that had once enchanted her was now directed outward, to actresses, secretaries, anyone who reflected his vanity. The rumors spread through Berlin's inner circles, whispered behind gloved hands. Magda knew them all, and though she suffered, she maintained her poise. To show pain would have been to betray the ideal she embodied. In moments of solitude, she wrote letters that revealed her private despair. "The nation believes in us," she once confessed to a friend, "and so we must believe, even when we no longer can." These words capture the essence of her tragedy, the inability to step outside the role she had chosen. To doubt was to collapse the illusion on which her world depended. Her children, her husband, even her own reflection had become extensions of the myth she served. And so she endured, transforming disillusionment into devotion, bitterness into discipline. Goebbels' career reached its zenith as Minister of Propaganda, his mastery of imagery shaping every heartbeat of the Reich. Posters, films, parades, all bore his signature. Magda watched the machinery of persuasion unfold from within, recognizing its beauty and its cruelty. She understood that truth was being sculpted daily into spectacle, and she played her part willingly. Her own appearances were staged with the same precision as his speeches. She stood beside Hitler at ceremonies, her face calm, her children immaculate, her smile as steady as a statue's. In photographs, she appears untouched by time, almost saintly, a fixed icon amid a world in motion. But behind that stillness, the cracks widened. Joseph's affairs multiplied, his letters to his lovers alternating between poetry and power. Magda confronted him once quietly, with a dignity that infuriated him more than anger would have. "You belong to history," she told him, "not to yourself." It was both accusation and resignation. She no longer fought for his fidelity. She fought for the image of devotion that gave her existence meaning. Her sense of worth had merged so completely with the collective myth that betrayal became irrelevant. Love, for her, had evolved into something abstract, no longer a personal bond but a ritual of endurance. By the late 1930s, Berlin glittered with triumph. The regime seemed eternal, the future secure. The Goebbels family was photographed at the Olympic Stadium, at grand receptions, in idyllic garden scenes. Each image was a lie that everyone agreed to believe. Yet Magda felt the chill beneath the celebration. She sensed that perfection demanded sacrifice and that every utopia is built upon silence. Her life, so radiant from afar, had become a series of performances, each day another rehearsal for faith. When she knelt with her children for evening prayers, she whispered words of gratitude that sounded more like defense than devotion. Still, she never wavered. To her friends, she spoke of destiny with the calm certainty of a believer. "Our lives are not ours," she would say. "They are the nation's." Perhaps she believed it, or perhaps belief had long since become indistinguishable from survival. Outside, the drums of the parades continued to beat, echoing through the streets like a collective heartbeat. She listened, sometimes in awe, sometimes in dread. And as the sound faded each night, she felt again that old sensation from her childhood, the quiet comfort of the cross above her bed, the illusion that order, once accepted fully, could make even chaos seem divine. The sound of drums never truly left her after that, even when the parades ceased and Berlin's nights fell silent beneath blackout curtains. It was 1939, and the world that the Goebbels household had so carefully constructed, of harmony, of sacred domestic order, was about to be swallowed by war. The first reports from Poland came not as shock, but as inevitability. Magda listened to Joseph as he spoke of destiny fulfilled, of Germany reclaiming its rightful place, his voice trembling with the intoxication of triumph. Yet as she looked out at the dark city, she saw not victory, but return. The same hunger, the same fever that had devoured Europe once before when she was a child. The faces in the streets were proud and fearful in equal measure. In their cheers she heard desperation, a collective plea to believe that history could be rewritten. The war years enveloped her in a paradox of grandeur and decay. She remained the immaculate mother of the Reich, her image printed on pamphlets and newsreels, the embodiment of strength and serenity. Her children, all blonde and smiling, stood as living proof of purity, paraded before cameras with the same discipline that soldiers displayed on the front lines. Magda fulfilled her public duties with precision, visiting hospitals, writing letters to mothers who had lost sons, standing beside Hitler at ceremonies that disguised despair as devotion. She spoke softly, with practiced empathy, her words woven from the same rhetoric she once merely admired. To many women she became an emblem of courage, but courage, for her, was no longer an emotion. It was an obligation, a mask she had long ago fused to her face. At home, the atmosphere grew tense. Joseph's affairs did not cease even in wartime. His vanity found nourishment in the attention of actresses and secretaries. Their quarrels became quieter but more dangerous, a struggle of faith rather than affection. When Magda threatened separation, Hitler himself intervened again, appealing to her sense of duty, reminding her that their union was symbolic, that it transcended personal suffering. "You are both too important to fail each other," he told her in his soft, almost pleading tone. Magda obeyed. She always obeyed. Perhaps obedience was the only language she truly understood, a language she mistook for love. In her diaries from those years, there are moments of clarity that break through the layers of loyalty. She writes of exhaustion, of nights spent awake listening to the distant thunder of bombers, of her children's steady breathing in the next room. "I feel the weight of a whole generation on my chest," she noted once, "and I cannot exhale." She no longer wrote of politics, but of fate, as if the two had become indistinguishable. Sometimes she described dreams, visions of cities on fire, of rivers flowing backward, of children walking silently through ruins. There's no trace of hysteria in her words, only the calm of someone who has accepted inevitability. By 1943, that inevitability had begun to take form. The war turned, and with it the fragile illusion of invincibility. The Goebbels villa near the Wannsee became a sanctuary of denial, filled with the laughter of children and the faint echo of lies. Magda insisted on maintaining normalcy. She hosted small gatherings, played piano, read fairy tales aloud at night. Yet outside their gates, Berlin was disintegrating. The air raids came more often, each one closer than the last. When the first bomb fell near their property, she gathered the children and led them calmly to the cellar, whispering prayers that mixed patriotism with faith. When the shaking stopped, she smiled and told them it was only thunder. To her, truth had long ceased to matter. Only composure remained sacred. In public, she was more revered than ever. The Ministry of Propaganda ensured her image survived even as reality crumbled. Photographs of her and the children circulated as symbols of perseverance. They were reminders of what was at stake, of what must not be lost. The irony was unbearable. While Joseph orchestrated illusions for the nation, Magda embodied the illusion itself. Her devotion became not an act of loyalty, but a ritual of survival, the only way to keep the abyss from swallowing her entirely. Joseph, meanwhile, was consumed by paranoia. His speeches grew more frenzied, his gestures sharper. He saw betrayal everywhere, in generals, in ministers, even in the silence of his wife. There were nights when he spoke for hours without pause, pacing the living room while Magda sat motionless, her face illuminated by the glow of the fireplace. She rarely interrupted, only watched as the man who had once spoken of destiny now spoke of doom, yet she could not bring herself to hate him. In his madness, she saw her own reflection, the same faith turned inward until it became self-destruction. There were brief moments when the facade cracked. During one of their last recorded arguments, she told him almost tenderly, "You are burning down the world so that your name will never go dark." He said nothing, only turned away, and the silence that followed between them became permanent. From then on, their partnership was one of ritualized unity, a performance for the sake of posterity. They appeared together at rallies, even as bombs fell around them, their smiles frozen, their eyes hollow. To the world, they were still the golden couple of the Reich, guardians of its moral image. Only those who looked closely could see that what bound them now was not love or even ideology, but the inertia of shared ruin. By late 1944, Berlin was a graveyard of echoes. Magda's letters became shorter, written in a steady hand that betrayed no panic. "We have lived through the greatest experiment of faith," she wrote in one, "and faith cannot retreat." That sentence, simple and chilling, is perhaps the purest reflection of her mind. For Magda, to live without belief was more terrifying than death. As the Reich's collapse accelerated, her devotion hardened into something that no longer resembled conviction but compulsion. She prayed not for victory but for meaning, for the promise that all this suffering would resolve into something greater than despair. When the bombs fell close enough to rattle the windows, she would hold her youngest child and whisper, "We must always stay together. That is what love means." Her definition of love had changed beyond recognition. It was no longer about preservation, but about unification through annihilation. Even now there was grace in her composure, a slow, quiet dignity that made those around her believe she still held the world together by sheer will. But behind that calm, a single thought had begun to take shape, a thought that would soon grow unbearable in its clarity. The night she first allowed herself to imagine the end, the city outside was silent, its fires dimmed by rain. She sat by the window, a candle burning beside her, the faces of her sleeping children reflected faintly in the glass. For a long time she watched their shadows, motionless. Somewhere in the distance a siren wailed and fell silent. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she prayed not to God, not to Germany, but to silence itself, to the peace that comes when all the noise, all the marching, all the voices finally stop. The prayer lingered in the dark like a breath that refuses to leave the body. The silence she prayed for never came, at least not in the form she imagined. By the beginning of 1945, the war had entered its final act, and Berlin was no longer a city, but a wound. Streets once paved with pride were reduced to rubble, and the sky, once filled with banners and searchlights, now belonged to the bombers. Magda Goebbels moved through this disintegrating world with an eerie calm, her composure so absolute it frightened those around her. The servants whispered that she no longer blinked at the sound of explosions. She carried herself as if she were already living beyond fear, beyond time, as if her spirit had detached itself from the body that still moved through the corridors of the villa on the Schwanenwerder Lake. The garden where her children once played was cratered and gray. The laughter that had once filled the house now came only in fragments, subdued by exhaustion. Yet she kept them dressed in clean clothes, their hair brushed, their manners intact. Civilization, for Magda, was a form of defiance against despair. Joseph, ever the propagandist, tried to maintain appearances long after reality had disintegrated. He still broadcast speeches on the radio, his voice trembling with manic conviction as he promised victory through sacrifice. Magda listened sometimes, not out of belief, but out of duty. His words no longer moved her. They sounded like echoes from another world. When he returned home, his face pale from sleepless nights, she offered him quiet acceptance instead of confrontation. There was nothing left to argue. Their marriage had transcended all earthly emotions. It existed now as symbol, as monument. They were no longer husband and wife, but priest and priestess at the altar of a dying faith. The Reich, once infinite in its arrogance, had shrunk to the claustrophobic corridors of the Führer bunker beneath the chancellery. In late April, as the Soviet army encircled Berlin, Magda and her children joined Joseph there at Hitler's request, or perhaps at his command. The journey through the bombed streets was a procession through death. Smoke coiled upward from ruins, and the stench of burning filled the air. Magda kept her eyes on the road, holding the smallest child's hand as if it were a relic of sanity. When they entered the bunker, she was struck by the unnatural stillness. The walls were painted white, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and disinfectant. The people who lived there spoke in whispers, their faces ghostly in the electric light. It felt less like a shelter than a tomb already sealed. In that underworld, time began to dissolve. The Goebbels children became both comfort and torment to everyone present. A vision of innocence preserved amid collapse. They played quietly in the hallways, their voices faint against the hum of the generators. Soldiers passing by would stop and smile, perhaps to remember what life had once been. Magda watched them with a serenity that concealed her growing certainty. There would be no rescue, no redemption. The ideology that had sustained her entire existence had turned inward, consuming itself. She could no longer imagine a world beyond these walls, and if such a world existed, she could not bear for her children to live in it. Her letters from those final days reveal a mind utterly surrendered to fatalism. "Life without honor is not life," she wrote to a friend, the words written in a steady, elegant hand. "The world that will come after this one is not for us." She saw herself and her children as part of a ritual of purification, not of despair. The concept of innocence, which once meant protection, had transformed into sacrifice. She had begun to view death as continuity, the only way to preserve the purity that the living world would soon desecrate. Joseph's devotion to Hitler grew feverish as the end approached. He spent hours in meetings, emerging with eyes bright from exhaustion, speaking of history and immortality. He believed, or pretended to believe, that their deaths would seal their place in legend. Magda listened and nodded. She no longer distinguished between his rhetoric and her own thoughts. They had merged into a single, inevitable conviction. When Hitler married Eva Braun in the bunker's narrow dining room, Magda helped arrange the flowers, her gestures careful, her face expressionless. She looked almost serene as she moved through the smoke-stained corridors, her white dress a ghostly contrast to the ruin around her. The night of April 30th, when news spread that Hitler had taken his own life, something within the bunker shifted. There were no cries, no hysteria, only the dull acceptance of finality. Magda sat with her children in their room, brushing the hair of the youngest girl, her movements slow and deliberate. She spoke softly, telling them that soon they would go on a journey where there was no fear, no hunger, no darkness. They listened, trusting her as they always had. The purity of that trust was unbearable to witness. Witnesses later described her composure as inhuman. She moved as if she were completing a sacred duty rather than committing an unthinkable act. She prepared the sleeping tablets and cyanide capsules with her husband's help, insisting on performing the act herself. "They are too good for the world that will come," she is said to have whispered. Her voice did not tremble. When the deed was done, she sat beside them for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing. The silence she'd prayed for had finally arrived. Not peace, but absence. The sound of breathing, laughter, footsteps, all gone. The world reduced to stillness. Later that night, she and Joseph ascended the narrow stairway leading back to the courtyard. The walls vibrated faintly with the rumble of artillery. He carried a pistol. She carried nothing. The air smelled of smoke and soil. They stepped into the open where the darkness was lit only by the fires consuming what was left of Berlin. For a moment she paused, looking up at the night sky where no stars were visible. Perhaps she thought of the lake house, of the children's laughter, of the cross that once hung above her bed. Or perhaps she thought of nothing at all. There was a brief flash, then silence. In the days that followed, Soviet soldiers found the bodies burned, the faces unrecognizable. The photographs that survive show only fragments, bones, fabric, ash. Yet from those remains, an image endures, not of the human beings they once were, but of the myth they had become. To some, they were monsters. To others, martyrs. To history, they are both and neither. Symbols of how devotion, stripped of reason, becomes its own form of annihilation. And so the story of Magda Goebbels ends as it began, in the shadow of belief. From the little girl tracing the cross on her bedroom wall to the woman sealing her children's fate in a bunker, her life moved within a single, unbroken circle. The search for order in chaos, for meaning in destruction. The symmetry she once found in faith had turned inward, consuming everything it touched. Perhaps in those final seconds, she felt a moment of clarity, a fleeting recognition that the order she sought had never existed outside the mind that longed for it. Above ground, the war would continue for a few more days. Then silence. Then history. But in that silence, one could almost hear her last prayer, fading like smoke into the spring air of Berlin, that the world would one day understand devotion, even when it destroys. The ruins of Berlin lingered for months like a fever that refused to break. When the smoke finally lifted, the world confronted what remained of the Reich, not its monuments, not its parades, but the quiet devastation left in the wake of conviction. Among the shattered walls and scorched marble, the names of those who had once ruled through belief were reduced to whispers, their power extinguished, but their myth still breathing faintly, like embers refusing to die. Magda Goebbels was gone, yet her image endured. Newspapers across Europe printed her face beside the ruins, calling her the German Medea, the high priestess of death, the mother who loved too absolutely. To many, she was the ultimate emblem of corrupted devotion. To others, she was simply the reflection of a world that had taught its daughters to mistake obedience for virtue. Her story, in the years that followed, would be retold not as history, but as warning. A parable of how faith, unexamined, can become a form of blindness. The investigators who entered the chancellery found fragments of her existence scattered among the debris. Jewelry boxes, photographs of the children, a burned rosary, a collection of letters half consumed by fire. Among them, one piece of paper bore her handwriting, delicate and precise even in despair. "We did not choose this path," it read. "We were chosen by history." The sentence carried both arrogance and surrender, the last echo of the ideology that had turned human beings into instruments of destiny. The bodies of the Goebbels children were buried quietly in a shallow grave near the bunker. No ceremony, no hymns, only the hurried labor of soldiers who wanted to be done with the past. But memory is not so easily buried. In the years that followed, photographs of their angelic faces would circulate endlessly, haunting a generation that could not comprehend how innocence could be extinguished so deliberately. For many Germans, Magda's act was incomprehensible, yet beneath the horror, there was a secret understanding that terrified them even more. She had not been mad, not in the way people wish to believe. Her calmness, her composure, the rational language of her letters, all revealed a woman acting out the final logic of an ideology she had absorbed until it replaced her conscience. In her world, loyalty had become the highest moral good, higher than love, higher than life itself. To betray that ideal would have been to betray the very structure of meaning that had sustained her since childhood. In that sense, her crime was not insanity but obedience, the terrible obedience of someone who mistook faith for truth. Historians have since dissected her with the same precision she once admired in machinery, her motives, her upbringing, her psychology. Some traced her tragedy back to her childhood abandonment, others to the rigid moral codes of Prussian womanhood that prized purity above self. Psychoanalysts found in her the perfect archetype of submission, the merging of female virtue with totalitarian ideology. Yet none of these explanations fully capture the stillness in her eyes in those last photographs. There was something there that transcended analysis, a serenity that made the horror more profound. She had found peace, but only by destroying everything that gave peace its meaning. The years after the war transformed her into a symbol, one that shifted depending on who was looking. To the victors, she embodied the moral collapse of Germany, the ultimate proof that even motherhood could be corrupted by fanaticism. To some Germans, especially women who had lived through the war's humiliation, she was a figure of pity, a woman who could not separate duty from identity. In secret, there were even those who spoke of her with reverence, as one who had chosen death over surrender. The human mind, exhausted by guilt, often seeks beauty in the very thing that destroyed it. Thus, Magda Goebbels continued to live in memory as both saint and sinner, both victim and perpetrator. Her son, Harald Quandt, the only child who survived because he was serving in the Luftwaffe at the time, became the lone thread connecting her story to the world that came after. Captured by Allied forces, he learned of his family's death while in a prison camp. The letter that brought the news described it briefly, almost bureaucratically, as if horror could be summarized in sentences. Witnesses said he wept without sound for hours, then fell into a silence that lasted years. When he was released, he inherited his father's industrial fortune, but lived as though haunted by a debt that could never be repaid. In his home, he kept a photograph of his mother and half-siblings, the image fading slowly with time. To his friends, he rarely spoke of her. When he did, his words carried both love and bitterness. He called her a woman who believed too much. In the post-war world, belief itself had become suspect. Across Europe, the survivors of fascism recoiled from the idea of conviction. They had seen where absolute certainty led. The philosophers of the New Age wrote of ambiguity, of the necessity of doubt. But Magda's story lingered at the edge of these reflections, like an accusation. Could a human being truly live without faith? Could morality exist without something to worship? In her life, these questions found no answer, only a circular path that began and ended in submission. She had lived by symbols, the cross, the flag, the Führer, and when each of them crumbled, she followed them into the void. As the decades passed, her name became a footnote in history books, overshadowed by the larger monstrosities of the war. Yet her image refused to fade completely. In every discussion of fanaticism, her figure reappeared. The mother who chose death for love, the believer who could not imagine a life beyond belief. Museums displayed her letters behind glass, their ink faded to a faint brown. School children read about her as a cautionary tale. Filmmakers and writers returned to her story, not out of fascination with evil, but with the fragility of conviction. She had become what she perhaps always wished to be, immortal, though not in the way she imagined. Sometimes in documentaries and historical exhibits, a voice reads her words aloud, soft and distant, almost tender. "If the world should fall," she wrote in one of her last notes, "then let it fall with dignity." Those who hear it often shiver without knowing why. Perhaps because the sentence captures something that lies buried not only in her but in everyone. The temptation to surrender to an idea so completely that the self disappears within it. Her life, stripped of ideology, remains a mirror held up to human longing, for order, for meaning, for transcendence. And so history remembers her not for who she was, but for what she reveals about the rest of us. She is the echo that follows every great collapse, the warning whispered through the centuries, that faith without doubt becomes tyranny, and love without mercy becomes destruction. Her story is not confined to the ruins of 1945. It belongs to every moment when devotion demands silence, when belief outweighs compassion, when certainty replaces thought. Somewhere in Berlin, beneath the layers of reconstruction, the bunker still sleeps in darkness. The walls that once heard her voice now listen only to the hum of the underground trains passing far above. Perhaps if one stands there long enough, one can almost imagine the sound of children laughing, of a woman's footsteps crossing the corridor, of a voice whispering a prayer for peace that never came. And then, as the echo fades, only silence remains, the same silence that followed her into eternity. History, with its relentless need for explanation, could never quite decide what to do with Magda Goebbels. Some called her the embodiment of the age's madness. Others dismissed her as a passive accomplice, a wife who simply followed her husband into the abyss. Yet those who looked deeper saw something far more unsettling. A woman who had not merely obeyed, but had believed. She was not driven by greed or cruelty in the ordinary sense, but by the purity of conviction that so often masks its own corruption. That was what made her story unbearable. She had destroyed her children not out of hatred, but out of love. In the ruins of that contradiction, post-war Germany saw its own reflection, the seductive comfort of obedience, the peril of mistaking order for goodness. And so she lingered, an unquiet ghost haunting the moral landscape of a nation trying to remember how to doubt. For decades after her death, journalists and biographers returned to her with a kind of horrified fascination. The early portrayals were unforgiving. They cast her as a calculating zealot, a woman who traded conscience for prestige. Later, as the century grew older and its faith in judgment weakened, she was rewritten in softer tones. A victim of ideology, a woman crushed beneath the machinery of patriarchy and propaganda. But neither version captured her essence. The truth, as always, was quieter and more intricate. Magda was both participant and prisoner, both mother and ideologue, both tender and terrifying. She embodied that most modern of tragedies, the soul that mistakes submission for transcendence. In the Germany that emerged from defeat, her image became taboo, a name seldom spoken aloud. Women who had once idolized her turned away, whispering her name only in private. The war widows and the mothers of the lost knew too well that her perfection had been built on lies. Yet in their exhaustion, they also understood her yearning for meaning. The myth of Magda, the serene, devout mother, had once promised them that suffering could be noble, that obedience could redeem. Now, as the rubble was cleared and democracy returned, they had to unlearn what they had once believed sacred. Magda's fall was not only her own, it was the collapse of an entire moral vocabulary. Meanwhile, her surviving son Harold carried his silence like a private sentence. He rebuilt his life among the ruins, his step measured, his face grave. Inheriting the quant fortune after the death of his father, he became a wealthy industrialist in the new Federal Republic, a symbol of West Germany's miraculous recovery. Yet prosperity brought no peace. The whispers about his family followed him everywhere. The fortune built with forced labor, the mother who murdered her children in the name of purity. Friends spoke of his restraint, his avoidance of intimacy, his discomfort with celebrations. At dinners, if the conversation drifted toward the war, he would grow silent, his gaze fixed on his glass. To the end of his life, he refused to speak publicly about Magda, as if by silence he could unmake the past. When his private plane crashed in 1967, killing him instantly, the newspapers spoke of another German tragedy. The last thread of the Goebbels name quietly cut, but history, as always, refuses finality. In the late 20th century, as new generations tried to understand the psychology of fascism, Magda's name returned to academic discourse. Feminist historians debated her place within the Nazi system. Was she its creation or its architect in miniature? Some argued that she represented the ideal womanhood envisioned by the Reich, submissive yet strong, elegant yet silent, the mother as vessel of ideology. Others saw in her a more dangerous figure, the believer who, denied agency in the public sphere, found power in private devotion. Her faith had not been imposed. She had chosen it, with the calm precision of someone building a cathedral within herself. In this reading, Magda was neither victim nor monster, but the embodiment of complicity, the face of evil made ordinary through piety. The fascination with her persisted not because of her crimes, but because she seemed to reveal a part of humanity most wished to deny. She was not monstrous in appearance or temperament. She was cultivated, gentle, maternal. The horror lay precisely in that normalcy. She showed that atrocity does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers lullabies. In her story, one can trace the thin thread that connects tenderness to destruction, faith to fanaticism, the domestic to the political. That thread, once visible, cannot be unseen. It is the same one that runs through every era when people surrender thought for certainty or love for ideology. As the century turned, filmmakers and writers began to revisit her with new eyes. Documentaries blended archival footage with her letters. Actors whispered her words in darkened rooms, as if summoning her spirit not to condemn her, but to understand. Some saw her as a tragic metaphor for Germany itself, brilliant, disciplined, yearning for order, ultimately consumed by its own myth of destiny. Others rejected all empathy, insisting that understanding her was the first step toward forgiving her. And yet, understanding is not forgiveness. It is remembrance. Each retelling of her life became an act of preservation, a warning disguised as biography. If one walks today through the streets of modern Berlin, lined with glass towers and echoes of new prosperity, it is difficult to imagine the city she once knew. Yet beneath the surface, the past still breathes. The bunker lies buried under parking lots and apartment blocks, its remains sealed beneath concrete. Tourists pass by unaware, their laughter blending with the hum of traffic. But for those who know where to look, history reveals itself in fragments: a charred stone in a museum, a photograph in an archive, a line of handwriting preserved behind glass. In these remnants, Magda's story endures, not as nostalgia, but as testimony. And perhaps this is her final irony. In seeking to make herself eternal through devotion, she succeeded only in ensuring that her name would never rest. She lives on not in glory, but in inquiry, not in admiration, but in the uneasy question she leaves behind. How does a human heart transform belief into obedience, and obedience into death? Each generation must answer it anew. Some nights, when the city is quiet and the wind moves softly through the Brandenburg Gate, it feels as though the ghosts of that time still walk unseen. The soldiers, the mothers, the children. Among them, perhaps, the faintest echo of Magda Goebbels' footsteps. Not the saintly figure of propaganda, not the demon of condemnation, but the woman who once stood before a cross and mistook its symmetry for peace. History cannot absolve her, nor can it erase her. It can only remember that she existed and that she believed. In the decades that followed, her story sank slowly beneath the weight of larger narratives. The world moved forward, reconstructing itself with steel and glass, and the ruins of the past were buried under modern streets. Yet every so often, Magda Goebbels' name surfaced again, carried on the tide of memory like a remnant that refused to be washed away. Scholars, novelists, theologians, each tried to find language for her, to fit her into their own moral architectures. But she resisted containment. She was too composed for madness, too devoted for innocence, too ordinary for monstrosity. She existed in that uneasy space where evil ceases to look foreign and begins to resemble the face one might pass in the mirror. That was her enduring power and her curse. She forced the world to confront not only what she did, but what she revealed about the human desire to belong to something absolute. In post-war Germany, the silence around her name became a form of collective therapy. For many women, the image of Magda, the elegant mother, the perfect wife, was a wound too intimate to touch. They had spent years being told that their worth lay in obedience, that their bodies and souls were extensions of the nation. After the war, that doctrine turned to ash, and in its place came confusion. What did it mean to be good, to be moral, to be German, when all the words that once carried virtue were now poisoned? In that uncertainty, Magda's image lingered like an accusation. She had embodied their ideals so perfectly that her destruction became the symbolic punishment of them all. To condemn her outright was to deny how familiar her virtues had once seemed. To pity her was to risk acknowledging how seductive faith can be when the world falls apart. By the 1960s, as the first generation of Germans born after the war came of age, her name returned to public conversation, no longer as a forbidden subject, but as an enigma to be deciphered. University students, burning with the need to confront their parents' silence, read her letters and diaries with trembling fascination. They saw in her the reflection of their mother's restraint, their refusal to question, their quiet endurance that had enabled unspeakable crimes to flourish. Some found anger in her serenity. Others saw only despair. For them, Magda represented not ideology, but inheritance, the burden of a history transmitted through manners, through gestures, through the unspoken language of submission. She became the ghost in every household where obedience still passed for virtue. Outside Germany, her story took on a different tone. In France, Britain, and America, she was portrayed as the dark muse of tyranny, a woman whose beauty hid a fanatic's heart. Films and biographies gave her the glamour of tragedy, the allure of fatal devotion. She became a symbol through which the world could process its fascination with the aesthetics of evil, the uniforms, the symmetry, the pageantry that had seduced millions. In this retelling, she was less a woman than a metaphor, the embodiment of how civilization itself can turn its longing for perfection into an appetite for destruction. Her life was recast as theater, the rise, the worship, the downfall, and yet beneath the dramatization, something real persisted, a quiet, unbearable question about the nature of faith when detached from mercy. Those who knew her personally, the few who survived the wreckage of the Reich, described her with ambivalence. Some remembered her as gentle, intelligent, and deeply maternal. Others as cold, unreachable, her eyes reflecting conviction like glass. One former maid recalled how Magda would stand at the window for hours in the final years, watching the garden while the children played, her hands clasped as though in prayer. "She had the look of someone listening," the woman said, "but I never knew to what." Perhaps she was listening to the whisper of the idea that had possessed her, the one that promised meaning in exchange for self. That was the sound she had followed all her life, the hum of purpose that made obedience feel holy. In the 1970s, new psychological studies sought to understand how entire nations could submit to ideology. Magda's life appeared in case studies and philosophical essays, dissected with clinical detachment. Words like totalitarian motherhood and mystical nationalism were used to explain her. But the more they analyzed, the more elusive she became. Facts could reconstruct her choices, but not the inner stillness that made them possible. What remained beyond explanation was the serenity with which she approached destruction, the peace that radiated from her even as she arranged her children's deaths. To modernize that calm was monstrous. To hers, it was sacred. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent seeking unity between the world and her soul. As Germany entered an era of remembrance, building memorials to the victims of its own delusion, Magda's name receded further from public sympathy. The children she murdered were mourned. She was not. And yet she was never forgotten. Each time a new monument was raised, each time another document surfaced, her presence hovered at the margins, a reminder that atrocity is not only the work of monsters in uniform, but also of mothers who pray. Her existence blurred the boundary between love and fanaticism, between moral conviction and moral collapse. To erase her would have been to erase the possibility that ordinary virtue can turn destructive when it worships purity over compassion. The century turned again, and with it came a new kind of remembrance, less judgmental, more reflective. Historians began to speak not only of guilt, but of complexity. They saw in Magda's life the anatomy of belief itself, how devotion, once detached from empathy, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. Her image appeared in documentaries framed by slow piano music, her letters read aloud in a voice both tender and distant. Modern viewers, living in an age saturated with ideology of different kinds, felt a flicker of recognition. The danger she represented was no longer historical, but timeless. It was the temptation of all who seek belonging in absolute truths, who find comfort in certainty when the world becomes too fractured to bear. And so, as the decades stretch further from 1945, Magda Goebbels remains neither forgiven nor condemned, but suspended in the strange permanence of moral inquiry. Her name continues to surface whenever humanity rediscovers its appetite for faith without doubt. She is not a figure of the past, but a mirror held to the present, the whisper reminding us that the desire for purity, if left unchecked, leads not to salvation but to silence. The bunker, the cross, the children's still faces, all of it becomes one recurring symbol, the cost of surrendering thought to belief. It is said that time heals all things, but perhaps time does not heal what it cannot understand. In the ruins of memory, Magda's voice still seems to linger, not as confession or justification, but as an echo of the eternal question: what do we become when the need for meaning outweighs the value of life itself? That question remains unanswered, and perhaps it always will, because each age, in its own way, must find her again, the beautiful believer who could not distinguish devotion from destruction, and ask itself whether it truly can. Time moved on, and yet the shadow of Magda Goebbels stretched quietly across the landscape of remembrance. In museums, her name was often hidden deep within the captions, spoken only when necessary, as though invoking her risked awakening something best left asleep. But the silence surrounding her was not born of indifference. It was the silence of discomfort, of recognition, for even those who condemned her could not entirely separate themselves from what she represented. The yearning for certainty, the longing to be part of something so vast that individuality dissolves. The modern world, with its endless doubts and fractured identities, could not help but see in her the distorted mirror of its own contradictions. She had lived and died for a promise of unity, and though her faith had turned monstrous, the need that had birthed it was deeply human. Historians began to re-examine her not as a symbol of evil, but as a case study in the psychology of devotion. They asked what it meant that a woman of education and intelligence, raised among books and music, could surrender so completely to a man, a movement, an idea. Some argued that she was a product of her time, the culmination of a society that taught women to find identity only through service. Others saw in her a more personal dimension, the wound of abandonment, the hunger for belonging that made her susceptible to ideology. But even these explanations felt inadequate. There was something in her that transcended biography, something that spoke to a universal fragility, the fear of insignificance. To escape that fear, she had embraced a faith that demanded total surrender. And when that faith collapsed, she chose annihilation over emptiness. The image of Magda, the composed, elegant woman surrounded by her children, remained frozen in the cultural memory of Germany like a photograph no one wished to frame but could never discard. The state that replaced the Reich had no use for her, yet she could not be erased. Every generation rediscovered her in some form, and every retelling tried to comprehend the fusion of beauty and horror she embodied. Filmmakers, searching for a language of moral ambiguity, turned her life into parable. In the dim light of reconstructed Berlin, actresses spoke her words in whispers, portraying her not as monster or martyr, but as a woman imprisoned by her own devotion. The camera lingered on her face, calm, remote, haunted by invisible music. Audiences watched in uneasy silence, aware that judgment offered no relief. Among the ruins of memory, her presence became a moral riddle. Could one condemn her without acknowledging the seduction of certainty? Could one pity her without betraying those who perished under the ideology she served? The tension remained unresolved, echoing through classrooms and debates. For younger generations born long after the war, she was not a figure of guilt, but of warning. A reminder that evil does not always announce itself with cruelty. It often begins with longing for meaning, for purpose, for order, in chaos. In this sense, Magda's tragedy was not uniquely German. It was human. She had mistaken obedience for strength, devotion for love, purity for virtue. And by the time she understood what she had done, she had already built a world where no truth could reach her. There were moments in the collective consciousness when she almost disappeared, years when her name was buried beneath new wars, new ideologies, new distractions. But history, as it does, circled back. In the early 21st century, as the world once again found itself drawn to extremes, her story returned with renewed relevance. Writers spoke of her in essays about radical belief, about the psychology of belonging in an age of fear. Documentaries paired her letters with modern footage, the candlelit bunker juxtaposed with city lights reflected in glass towers. Viewers saw in her a familiar pattern, the hunger for authority disguised as moral clarity. And though her century had passed, her silence spoke directly to theirs. In Berlin, a new generation of curators debated whether to include her name in exhibitions about the war. Some argued she should remain in the shadows. Others insisted that understanding her was essential to understanding how the world collapses. One historian put it simply, she reminds us that faith is not harmless when it ceases to question. Visitors, walking through the galleries, would stop before a photograph of her children, 5 girls and 1 boy, all with identical ribbons in their hair, and then look away quickly, as if the innocence in their eyes accused them of something indefinable. Beside that image, a small caption read, Magda Goebbels, mother of 6, died April 1945. Devotion became silence. It was enough. Meanwhile, in academic conferences and literary salons, her name resurfaced in unexpected contexts, discussions of motherhood, ideology, and moral choice. Psychologists spoke of the Magda condition, the psychological state in which love transforms into possession, faith into fatalism. The phrase caught on briefly, then faded, but its meaning endured. The reminder that when compassion is replaced by ideology, even tenderness can become destructive. The same word that once defined her, devotion, became redefined as danger. And yet, amid all the analysis and judgment, there were still those who felt an uneasy sympathy for her. They did not excuse her. They simply recognized the abyss she had fallen into, the emptiness that exists when every anchor of belief is stripped away. They saw that her final act, as horrific as it was, came not from malice but from terror, the terror of facing a world without the structure that had given her existence coherence. In that recognition lay the story's deepest unease, that under different circumstances, in different forms, that terror lives in everyone. The bunker, sealed beneath layers of earth and asphalt, became her unmarked tomb. No monument bears her name, no prayer is spoken for her. And yet, on certain evenings when rain falls softly over the city, the air seems to hold a peculiar quiet, as though Berlin itself pauses to remember, not to forgive, not to mourn, but simply to acknowledge that she was part of its soul, the part that once mistook darkness for light. Her presence is everywhere and nowhere, in the reflection of torchlight on polished marble, in the rhythm of disciplined footsteps, in the voice that whispers of destiny when reason falters. Magda Goebbels remains a question that history cannot answer, a lesson it cannot fully learn. She stands at the intersection of belief and destruction, where the need for order becomes a form of violence. Her life reminds us that evil is not always loud, that it can speak in the calm tones of conviction and the soft gestures of love. And perhaps that is why she endures, not as memory but as warning. Every era creates its own faiths, its own myths of salvation. Somewhere in those myths, her reflection still waits, serene and terrible, her eyes fixed on a horizon that no longer exists. Even now, so many years after her death, Magda Goebbels' presence lingers in the folds of history, like a scent that refuses to fade. She exists less as a person and more as an atmosphere, a quiet pressure at the edge of remembrance, reminding the world how close faith and destruction can stand to one another. In Germany's memorial culture, her name remains the one that no stone bears, the one that museums approach only through the shadow she left behind. It is as though acknowledging her fully would mean confessing something about humanity itself, that the same need for order, for moral clarity, for belonging that gives structure to our lives can also lead us to the edge of ruin when stripped of doubt. The tragedy of Magda Goebbels lies not only in her actions, but in their familiarity. Her devotion was not foreign, but terribly human. To speak of her is to reopen wounds that never truly closed. Each attempt to understand her, to fix her within the taxonomy of evil, becomes a mirror turned back toward those who study her. She draws the observer in, forcing uncomfortable recognition, for she was not driven by hatred in the crude sense. She loved her children, she loved her country, she believed in destiny. Those words, spoken in another context, would sound noble, but in her hands they became instruments of annihilation. What makes her unbearable is not that she lacked conscience, but that she mistook conscience for obedience, that she acted out of what she believed was moral necessity. Her tragedy exposes how virtue itself can decay when detached from compassion. In the years following the war, as West Germany rebuilt itself from ashes, her absence became symbolic. Streets were renamed, statues removed, entire histories rewritten in the hope of cleansing the past. But some absences are too precise to erase. The ideal of the German mother, the archetype she embodied so perfectly, remained quietly embedded in cultural memory, its outlines softened but intact. Women of her generation continued to teach their daughters restraint, order, endurance, even as they repudiated the ideology that had once sanctified those virtues. In that transmission, a piece of Magda's legacy persisted, not as belief, but as gesture. The quiet folding of hands, the endurance of silence, the calm face that hides disquiet. In this way, she survived not in monuments, but in mannerisms. As the decades advanced, the fascination surrounding her took on new forms. Writers began to weave her story into fiction, transforming her from historical figure into allegory. In novels and plays, she appeared as a spectral presence, the voice of conscience or the embodiment of a world seduced by clarity. Artists painted her face as a study in contradiction, half illuminated, half in shadow. Some works depicted her surrounded by her children, not in horror, but in stillness, the moment before death stretched into eternity. Others portrayed her alone, as if awaiting judgment that would never come. These representations revealed the impossibility of closure. Every attempt to depict her seemed to circle the same question. Where does responsibility end when belief consumes the self? The theologians who wrote about her often approached her through paradox. To them, Magda was the final consequence of idolatry, the replacement of divine mystery with human certainty. Her devotion to Hitler, they said, was not simply political, but religious, an inversion of faith that replaced God with ideology. In her own writings, fragments of this blasphemous spirituality appear. She spoke of destiny, of grace through loyalty, of purity as salvation. It was not mere propaganda to her, it was liturgy. She turned her domestic world, the table, the children, the evening prayers, into a shrine of the regime. And in doing so, she blurred forever the boundary between love and worship, between the sacred and the political. That confusion, theologians warned, is not confined to her time. It repeats wherever power clothes itself in moral certainty. Psychologists, for their part, found in her a perfect case of moral dissociation. They spoke of cognitive dissonance, of how the human mind can hold two irreconcilable truths, love and destruction, and weave them into harmony. For Magda, to kill her children was not murder, but protection, not sin, but sacrifice. She saw herself not as executioner, but as mother, shepherding her children into eternity. This inversion of morality fascinated and terrified those who studied her. It showed that reason is not always the safeguard we believe it to be. That logic, when guided by false premises, can lead even the kind-hearted to atrocities. She was, in their view, both victim and perpetrator of an inner theology, a faith so complete it left no room for mercy. In the public imagination, however, Magda gradually drifted toward abstraction. She became a symbol invoked whenever history seemed to repeat its own mistakes. Her name surfaced during revolutions, during wars, during acts of blind nationalism. Journalists used her as shorthand for the moral blindness of those who surrender conscience for ideology. The Magda effect, one essay called it, the phenomenon of moral transformation through devotion, where empathy collapses under the weight of belief. Such phrases attempt to keep her at a distance, but each one betrays an uneasy closeness. Her story is not merely about one woman in a ruined bunker. It is about the recurring human impulse to find redemption through destruction. Yet behind the endless interpretations, there remains the faint trace of her humanity. The letters she wrote to friends before the war reveal moments of tenderness, humor, even self-awareness. She loved music, collected poetry, admired the quiet dignity of ordinary people. There are notes where she writes of her children's laughter, of the way the sunlight fell on the lake outside their home, of how peace felt like something that could be cultivated through beauty. It is that intimacy, not her ideology, that makes her haunting. To know that such sensitivity coexisted with such brutality is to confront the duality within every human soul. She was neither purely evil nor purely deluded, but an intricate tapestry of longing and belief, woven too tightly to be undone. In the archives, her handwriting remains delicate and consistent, as though she never allowed emotion to disturb her composure. Historians who study it speak of the elegance of her penmanship, the balance of each curve, a reflection, perhaps, of her lifelong pursuit of symmetry. Even her words, when describing horror, maintain an eerie serenity. It is as if she wished to control the chaos through language, to impose beauty upon the unbearable. That desire for aesthetic order, which once guided her in domestic life, became her final illusion, the belief that perfection, even in death, could redeem imperfection in life. And perhaps this is why her name endures, not because of the crimes she committed, but because she personifies the seduction of harmony in a world built on dissonance. Her life reminds us that the yearning for purity, for coherence, for moral simplicity, can become the seed of destruction when it denies contradiction. Magda Goebbels' legacy, then, is not confined to a single time or ideology. It is the eternal human struggle between faith and doubt, between the order we crave and the chaos that defines us. Her story remains unfinished because it is, in a sense, everyone's story. The quiet tragedy of believing too completely in the illusion that order can make us whole. In the years that followed, the world grew noisier, more fragmented, as if history itself were trying to drown out its own echoes. Yet beneath the hum of modern life, Magda Goebbels' name persisted like a vibration felt rather than heard, a faint resonance of the century's greatest disquiet. People no longer spoke of her often, and when they did, it was with a kind of hesitation, as though summoning a figure who existed not in the past, but in the recurring patterns of human belief. For each new generation that rediscovered her story found that it belonged not only to Germany, nor even to the age of fascism, but to the timeless human inclination to surrender to the idea of destiny. Her devotion had been monstrous, yes, but it was built from familiar materials: love, loyalty, longing, fear. That was what made her enduring, because in her reflection, humanity could still recognize itself. By the late 20th century, Germany had transformed into a land of light and reconstruction, where the ruins were preserved only as warnings. Yet in that air of renewal, the memory of women like Magda remained unsettled. The nation had learned to mourn its victims, to confront its crimes. But what to do with the perpetrators who were also human? The question hung over the new republic like a faint mist, delicate but persistent. For Magda's face, calm and maternal, resisted the narrative of monstrousness that history demanded. She did not fit comfortably into the gallery of villains. Her evil was domestic, quiet, intimate, the kind that wears silk gloves and speaks softly before extinguishing the world. This contradiction unsettled those who studied her. It was easier to condemn brutality when it was loud. Her gentleness complicated everything. Scholars began to speak of her as an ideological mother, a figure through whom the state had reimagined love as duty and sacrifice as sanctity. They traced her lineage back through centuries of myth: the virgin mother, the patriotic widow, the martyr whose suffering redeems others. Magda, they argued, was the culmination of these archetypes, the final distortion of an ancient ideal. Her face, composed and radiant in photographs, became the last mask of an entire civilization's illusions about purity. Behind her smile stood centuries of women taught to sanctify obedience, to turn pain into virtue. That realization struck deeply into the cultural psyche of post-war Europe. It meant that her story was not just the failure of one woman, but of the ideals that had shaped her. As feminism gained voice and strength, Magda's figure took on new meaning. She became a paradoxical emblem, both the victim of patriarchy and its fiercest enforcer. Women writers examined her letters with a kind of grim fascination, tracing the ways she had internalized the language of male authority until it became her own. Her devotion to Hitler, to her husband, to the Reich, was, in this reading, the perfection of the submissive role society had crafted for her, but it was also her rebellion against it. In destroying herself and her children, she seized the only form of power she believed remained to her: control over the terms of their destiny. It was, in its perverse way, an assertion of agency, a refusal to be conquered by the world she helped create. In this light, Magda became less a monster and more a mirror reflecting the terrifying logic of a society that had left women no path between obedience and annihilation. Yet even this interpretation could not contain her. For every attempt to explain her, there was an undercurrent of unease, as though explanation itself were an act of betrayal. To understand her too well risked empathy, to condemn her too easily risked blindness. She existed in that narrow space where judgment falters, where the categories of good and evil collapse under the weight of their own simplicity. Philosophers writing about her life described her as a soul devoured by order. The phrase lingered in essays and lectures, repeated with quiet reverence. It captured something essential, not only about Magda, but about the century that had produced her. The hunger for order, for clarity, for purity of purpose had consumed entire nations. She was its most intimate expression, the domestic face of apocalypse. In the archives, her voice remained preserved in ink, letters to friends, to her husband, to her son. Reading them, one senses not madness but lucidity. She writes of the children's play, of the seasons changing, of the moral duty to remain faithful. The calm in her tone is more terrifying than any confession of rage. She saw her life as a thread woven into a grand tapestry of destiny, and when that tapestry began to unravel, she chose to end it rather than watch it fray. The horror lies in her clarity. There is no hysteria, no loss of composure, only the steady rhythm of conviction. That composure, so admired in life, became her curse in death. It was the shield that allowed her to commit the unthinkable without breaking. In the decades after the war, survivors of the Nazi regime often spoke of the impossibility of truly separating ideology from intimacy. Magda's story became their most haunting example. How does one love purely when one's idea of purity has been poisoned? How does one believe in goodness when goodness itself has been redefined by power? The question echoed far beyond Germany, into every place and time where belief becomes absolute. Her life became a metaphor not for fascism alone, but for the human tendency to make gods of our own convictions. Wherever people sought salvation through destruction, her shadow appeared, silent, unyielding, instructive. In Berlin today, the site of the Führer bunker lies beneath a parking lot, unmarked except for a discreet plaque that lists no names. Tourists pass without knowing what lies beneath their feet, unaware that just meters below, one of the 20th century's most chilling acts unfolded in eerie calm. The ground above is ordinary, anonymous, almost peaceful, a fitting tomb for those whose lives were consumed by the illusion of eternity. It is said that at dusk, when the light softens and the city's noise recedes, the air there feels unusually heavy, as if the earth itself remembers. Not in sorrow, not in guilt, but in quiet witness. Beneath that ground where Magda Goebbels ended her life and those of her children, history still breathes. It is not a place of mourning, nor of reverence, but of contemplation, a reminder that devotion without mercy will always return to silence. And perhaps that is the true legacy she left behind, not the ideology she served, not the propaganda she embodied, but the silence that followed her. For in that silence one hears the echo of a truth too painful to name, that even the purest intentions can lead to ruin when they are guided by certainty instead of compassion. Every generation inherits that silence anew, and within it the same warning that her life once whispered, "Beware of the comfort of clarity, for it is in that comfort that humanity loses itself." In the slow turning of decades, the silence surrounding Magda Goebbels became part of the architecture of post-war memory. It was a silence shaped not by forgetting, but by fatigue, a collective exhaustion in the face of something too complex to condemn, too monstrous to forgive. The ruins had been rebuilt, the rubble swept away, but beneath the clean lines of the new Germany, the old questions continued to breathe. What kind of faith leads a woman to extinguish her own children in the name of love? What form of loyalty requires that the heart be silenced? These were not questions that could be answered by historians alone. They belonged to the moral imagination of a nation still struggling to understand how its longing for redemption had turned into catastrophe. And so, Magda remained a presence without a monument, a symbol both invisible and unavoidable, suspended between history and myth. By the late 20th century, her story had become a strange kind of mirror, reflecting whatever a generation feared most about itself. In the age of Cold War ideologies, she was invoked as the ultimate warning against blind allegiance. In the years of consumer optimism, she became the ghost of sincerity, a reminder that meaning, once misplaced, can destroy more completely than hate. Academics wrote of her as the anatomy of faith without conscience, while poets imagined her last moments as a dark lullaby. The tone of these retellings was neither sensational nor redemptive. It was weary, almost tender, as if the world had finally learned that judgment without understanding changes nothing. They were trying in their own way to reconcile the unbearable contradiction she embodied, that love, when twisted by dogma, can become the most disciplined form of cruelty. Somewhere between theology and psychology, a few writers began to wonder whether Magda's tragedy lay not in her fanaticism, but in her fear of emptiness. Perhaps she could not imagine a life stripped of grand design, a life lived without myth. To such souls, ambiguity is unbearable. They crave clarity the way the body craves air. When the Reich promised her transcendence, she believed not out of wickedness, but out of necessity. Her devotion was the only antidote she knew to despair. This interpretation did not excuse her. It revealed how close despair and devotion can lie to each other, how quickly the need for meaning can turn malignant. It suggested that the great moral collapse of her age was not unique to its politics, but an eternal feature of the human condition. the peril of believing that salvation requires obedience. In the archives of her surviving letters, there is one fragment written not long before the end, where she describes her children's faces as the image of purity that must not be defiled by the coming world. The sentence is almost unbearable in its serenity. It exposes the logic of apocalypse disguised as mercy, the conviction that death could preserve innocence where life could not. To modern readers, that logic is unspeakable. To Magda, it was inevitable. Her words reveal no hatred, only a terrible peace. That, perhaps, is why her story continues to haunt. The world is filled with loud villains, but she was the quiet kind, the one who kills in the name of grace. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, as Germany was reunited and its history re-examined, the subject of Magda Goebbels surfaced once more in exhibitions and documentaries. Her life became a prism through which curators explored the role of women in totalitarian regimes. Some portrayed her as the final mask of fascism, the maternal image that made cruelty seem tender, the human face placed over the inhuman machine. Others argued that she was as much a product as a perpetrator, shaped by a culture that sanctified obedience and denied doubt. Viewers moved through the galleries in uneasy silence. Before them were photographs of her children, their pale faces unaged by time, and beside them a single image of Magda herself, serene and inscrutable. No caption could explain her. The curators understood that words would only diminish what she represented. They left the interpretation to the gaze of those who lingered, each seeing in her whatever they feared most about conviction. Her son Harold's death in the 1960s had closed the last direct link to her bloodline, but her spiritual lineage continued to echo in unexpected ways. Every generation seemed to rediscover her when history began to darken again, when fanaticism rose under new names, when nations began once more to speak of purity, when faith hardened into certainty. Writers would quote her last words. Philosophers would invoke her as a case study. Journalists would use her name as a warning headline. She became an adjective, Magda-like, meaning composed, devout, fatal. Even those who never studied her life felt the faint weight of her example, as though she were not only a figure from history, but a law of it, the law that devotion, untempered by mercy, always leads to destruction. As the 21st century unfolded, technology replaced banners, and faith found new languages. Yet the pattern she embodied repeated itself in subtler forms. Ideologies, political movements, even personal obsessions began again to promise belonging through certainty. Once more, people found comfort in the simplicity of absolute truths. And once more, the same shadow lengthened, the quiet readiness to silence whatever threatens that comfort. In this new world, Magda's story acquired an even more disturbing relevance. She was no longer merely a historical caution, but a prophecy, fulfilled again and again in different guises. Her tragedy had become a parable for the age of conviction, a reminder that fanaticism is not confined to politics, but can live wherever people confuse order with meaning. Berlin, meanwhile, continued to rise above her. Cafes replaced ruins. The hum of trams and conversation filled the air where bombers once roared. The past had been carefully folded into the present, visible only in glimpses. A plaque here, a stone there, a museum behind glass. Yet beneath the surface, the old silence still lived. Those who walked past the unmarked site of the bunker sometimes described a strange stillness, as if the earth itself held its breath. It was not guilt, not even grief, but something quieter. A recognition that the line between devotion and delusion is thinner than memory admits. The city had forgiven much, but it could not forget that truth. Perhaps that is where Magda's story truly ends. Not in the bunker, not in the flames, but in the moral residue she left behind. Her life remains a warning against the comfort of totality, the illusion that goodness can exist without contradiction. She stands for the peril of moral clarity, for the beauty that hides in every ideology before it turns to ash. There will always be those who look at her and see only evil, and those who look at her and see only tragedy. But perhaps the most honest response is silence, the kind that recognizes that she was both, and that within her contradictions lies the blueprint of our own. In that silence, history continues to speak. It tells us that every age produces its Magdas, believers who mistake devotion for virtue, who follow order into oblivion, who build sanctuaries that turn into tombs. The lesson is never finished because belief itself never disappears. It only changes costume. And somewhere, always, there is another soul staring at a symbol on a wall, seeing in its symmetry the promise of peace, not knowing that the order she seeks will one day destroy her. The longer history carries her name, the less she belongs to any single time. Magda Goebbels has become an echo in the corridors of human memory, not the woman herself, but what she represents, the terrible beauty of conviction unbroken even by ruin. Each generation, when it looks back into the dark mirror of the 20th century, finds her waiting there, serene as ever, her calm face daring the living to understand her. The temptation is always to draw a line, to say she was part of another world, a world so poisoned by ideology that its moral logic no longer applies to ours. Yet when one looks closer, the distance collapses. Her need to believe, to find meaning in obedience, is not confined to a single century. It survives, disguised and modernized, in every heart that seeks certainty at the expense of doubt. This is the paradox of Magda's endurance. She remains timeless not because her faith was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary, taken to its furthest and most merciless conclusion. The quiet persistence of her story reveals something that history rarely admits, that evil, when clothed in the garments of devotion, can appear almost virtuous. Those who watched her in life did not see a monster. They saw refinement, composure, sincerity. They saw a woman who embodied all the qualities that societies admire: discipline, loyalty, piety, love. Only later did they realize that these same virtues, when deprived of reflection, can turn lethal. She was the fulfillment of an ideal that the world had mistaken for goodness. And when that ideal demanded blood, she gave it without hesitation. In this way, she did not so much defy her world as complete it. She was the perfection of a belief that had forgotten how to be human. There is a strange tenderness in the way time has handled her. Historians dissect her choices, artists reinterpret her image, philosophers debate her motives, yet none have managed to extinguish the sense of stillness that surrounds her memory. It is as though the past itself handles her carefully, aware that she is too fragile to be hated, too guilty to be mourned. Even now, her face in photographs, composed, faintly smiling, eyes calm as water, unsettles the viewer. It is not the face of cruelty. It is the face of conviction, untouched by doubt, serenely wrong. That expression has outlived her. It can still be found anywhere belief becomes armor against conscience. The calm face that justifies what should never be justified, the gentle voice that explains why mercy must yield to duty. These are the descendants of her faith, living quietly in every age. The moral philosophers who returned to her story in the early 21st century often approached it from a new angle, not to condemn her actions, which needed no defense, but to examine the conditions that made them possible. They wrote that societies in crisis always generate a Magda, a figure who converts chaos into moral order by giving herself entirely to an idea. When nations fracture, when meaning collapses, the promise of total faith becomes irresistible. It offers simplicity where there was complexity, unity where there was conflict, and peace where there was fear. In such moments, the boundaries between holiness and fanaticism vanish. Magda's life is the anatomy of that transformation, the point where devotion ceases to illuminate and begins to consume. Among the letters found in the ruins of her home, one line has been quoted more than any other: "We have lived by faith, and faith must not die." The words are neither confession nor apology. They are creed. They suggest that she walked into death not as defeat, but as continuation, as though stepping from one form of belief into another. For her, the end of the world was not tragedy, but transfiguration. To read those words now is to feel the chill of recognition. Every ideology carries within it the temptation to declare itself sacred, to demand loyalty that exceeds reason. And every time it does, Magda's shadow stirs, reminding the living how easily the language of salvation can become the language of death. When visitors today stand before the exhibits that bear her name, they often fall silent. There are no speeches to make, no outrage left unspoken, only a quiet awareness that the line separating moral conviction from moral blindness is as thin as breath. The glass displays hold her letters, a locket, the photograph of her children. Time has faded the ink, but not the gravity of her words. Some read them and feel anger, others pity, but most leave with a sense of unease, the recognition that they, too, live in a world hungry for certainty. The difference lies only in the form the faith takes, not in the impulse itself. Outside, Berlin moves with its ordinary rhythm. Cars pass, lights change, the murmur of life continues above the buried past. The ground that once trembled under marching boots now carries bicycles and trams. Yet even this ordinariness feels fragile, as though history could, at any moment, remember itself. When rain falls, it darkens the stone, and the city seems briefly transparent, its present dissolving into the memory beneath. Somewhere, beneath the streets, the bunker still exists in fragments, sealed, silent, enduring. It is said that on certain nights, the air grows unusually still there, as if the earth itself is listening, not for forgiveness, but for comprehension. For the human mind is still trying to understand how love could turn into such disciplined destruction, how belief could become so calm in the face of horror. Perhaps the closest one can come to understanding Magda Goebbels is to see her not as a monster from a vanished past, but as a warning written into the human condition. Her life reminds us that the need for meaning can become a weapon, that the longing for purity can strip us of empathy, that the refusal to question is itself a form of violence. She is the eternal figure standing at the edge of every ideology, whispering that peace can be found through obedience, that certainty is the highest virtue, that surrender is salvation. And she is the silence that follows when we believe her. Her story, at its core, is not about politics, but about faith. Faith so absolute that it erases the boundary between salvation and destruction. In that sense, her legacy transcends her century. It belongs to every moment when humanity chooses order over compassion, conviction over thought. She will never entirely fade, because she is not merely remembered. She is repeated, reinterpreted, reborn each time. Belief forgets humility. The ruins of Berlin may rest, but the question she leaves behind remains awake. What becomes of the human soul when it believes that love demands purity, and purity demands death? Even as history tried to fold her story away, Magda Goebbels lingered in the silence between what is known and what can never be spoken. The world had rebuilt itself, had promised to learn, had sworn that such devotion would never again find fertile ground. Yet with every passing decade, her reflection appeared again, sometimes faintly, sometimes clear as glass, Whenever humanity flirted once more with the comfort of absolutes, her presence was not one of haunting, but of reminder. She did not return to accuse, but to warn. For the tragedy of Magda Goebbels was not her uniqueness, it was her ordinariness, her perfectly human desire to live within a structure that gave her certainty. And as long as people sought that same certainty, she would never truly disappear. Writers in the 21st century began to notice how her image had evolved. She was no longer portrayed as the loyal disciple of evil, nor as a motherly martyr, but as something quieter and more terrible, a symbol of how private virtue can coexist with public horror. They wrote of her as a woman whose gentleness was her weapon, whose obedience carried the weight of a nation's delusion. In her, they saw not the extremes of ideology, but its intimate form, the domesticating of belief until it sits beside the bed, sings lullabies, and teaches the innocent that death can be beautiful if done for the right reason. She had made horror look graceful. That was her most enduring crime. Artists, searching for the language of contradiction, returned to her letters. Painters traced her face over landscapes of ash. Composers wrote movements inspired by her final hours, slow and mournful, where melody disintegrated into silence. The performances were not about redemption, they were about recognition. Audiences sat in the half-dark, listening, watching, waiting for a revelation that never came. For Magda's story does not end in catharsis. It ends in stillness, the stillness of a woman who believed she had fulfilled her duty, who could not imagine another truth. That stillness remains unbearable to witness because it exposes something the world continues to conceal, that evil does not always rage. Sometimes it smiles and speaks softly and calls itself love. In psychological studies, her name became shorthand for the danger of moral certainty. Analysts explored the phenomenon they called the Goebbels paradox, the process by which conscience, instead of resisting ideology, merges with it. They described how the capacity for empathy, when directed solely toward one's own moral circle, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty toward those outside it. Magda's compassion was real but selective. Her love was deep but confined. She had built a moral world so narrow that it could contain her children but not humanity. In that narrowness lay her undoing. She believed she was protecting purity, but she was only protecting illusion. Modern scholars saw in her the anatomy of what happens when morality loses its universality, when good becomes the private property of belief. In the few surviving photographs of her with the children, the camera captures what words cannot. Her posture is serene, the children radiant, their faces open to the light. There is no hint of fear, no shadow of the future. It is a portrait of perfect order, a harmony so complete that it feels fragile, almost glass-like. The viewer knows what she did, and that knowledge cracks the image from within. To look at her is to see both tenderness and death, interwoven so delicately that one cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. That paradox, maternal care turned absolute, has made her more haunting than any figure of violence. She is not the destroyer, but the believer, and belief, in her hands, was more lethal than hatred could ever be. The moral philosophers of our age often return to her when speaking of conscience under tyranny. They point to the ease with which the desire to serve can become the desire to dominate, to how submission to an idea often masks a hunger for significance. Magda had found in the Reich not merely an ideology, but a purpose that answered every private wound. The father she had lost, the order she craved, the meaning she could not locate in herself. The regime gave her a script, and she played her role flawlessly until the curtain fell. The tragedy is that she could never imagine a life without that stage. To her, freedom was not liberation, It was chaos, and so she chose to end her story in the only way that preserved its symmetry. Death, for her, was not defeat, but completion. Her final act continues to resist explanation because it lies beyond the reach of ordinary psychology. It was not madness, not desperation, not even loyalty alone. It was ritual. In that dim bunker surrounded by the dying empire she had worshipped, Magda performed what she believed was a sacred duty. She did not see horror. She saw purification. She believed that by ending her children's lives, she was preserving them from a world without faith. That thought, which chills the soul, is also what gives her story its enduring power. For it is the point where human love and human delusion become indistinguishable. When affection becomes theology, when devotion becomes destiny, the result is not holiness, but annihilation. In the quiet decades after the war, those who survived the regime often confessed that what disturbed them most was not the violence itself, but the normalcy of those who carried it out. Magda embodied that normalcy in its most polished form. Her calm, her gentleness, her cultured manners, all of it proved that civilization is not the opposite of barbarism, but its disguise. She showed that the line between refinement and atrocity can vanish the moment morality becomes aesthetic. To her, beauty was truth, order was virtue, symmetry was salvation. She lived her entire life within that triad, and it led her into the abyss. Today, historians use her as a warning against the seduction of moral perfection. In an age where ideologies again promise purity, political, cultural, spiritual, her story returns like a pulse. The faces change, the banners change, but the melody remains the same, the hymn of devotion sung in the name of certainty. Magda's legacy is not her ideology, but the form of her faith. She is what happens when the human need for meaning forgets humility. Her tragedy is not confined to the ruins of Berlin. It lives wherever someone believes that to love the world is to control it. As twilight falls over the modern city, Berlin glows with light and movement, indifferent to the past that sleeps beneath it. Yet if one stands still long enough, in the quiet between the passing trams, a faint tremor seems to rise from the ground, as if history were still breathing, slow and invisible. Perhaps it is only imagination, the echo of everything that has been buried. Or perhaps it is the earth remembering that once, in its depths, a woman whispered a prayer for peace and carried her children into silence. The wind moves softly through the streets, and the sound of it might almost be her voice, calm, unwavering, certain that devotion is redemption. It is the same certainty that still whispers in different tongues, in different ages. The certainty that builds empires and burns them, that turns love into duty and duty into death. That certainty is what Magda Goebbels has left behind, not as a relic, but as a rhythm. It moves quietly through the veins of civilization, disguised as virtue, waiting for another believer to mistake its calmness for truth. And perhaps that is why we still speak her name, not to remember her, but to remind ourselves how easily her faith could become our own. There is a moment in every century when history pauses to look at itself, unsure of what it has become. In those moments when the noise of progress subsides and the world sees its reflection too clearly, the faces of its ghosts return. Magda Goebbels is one of those faces, not in the way of legends or martyrs, but as a question, unanswered, unending. Who are we, she asks, when our search for order destroys what makes us human? The question does not accuse, it merely lingers, patient and unwavering, as if time itself owed her a response. And yet there is no response to give. Her story cannot be explained by evil alone, nor by circumstance, nor even by madness. It exists in the liminal space between belief and surrender, between love and annihilation. It is what happens when conviction outlives conscience. Those who have studied her life in detail know that the most frightening thing about her is not what she did, but how calmly she did it. That serenity, so admired by her contemporaries, so devastating in retrospect, has become the emblem of her legacy. Even now, in documentaries and scholarly panels, her name provokes a particular unease. She was not the shrieking ideologue or the raving zealot that moral comfort demands. She was graceful, articulate, self-contained. The monstrousness of her actions resided precisely in that grace. To watch her smile in those archival films, poised beside her husband or standing a few steps behind Hitler, is to witness the seductive mask of fanaticism, the illusion that morality can exist without compassion, that purity can be achieved without cruelty. She embodied the quiet face of totalitarian virtue, a calm more chilling than rage. In the years after the war, as the world tried to codify morality into laws and declarations, Magda's story remained a splinter in the conscience of modern civilization. Her life blurred the categories upon which post-war ethics were built. If she was evil, she was not monstrous. If she was innocent, she was not blameless. She was both the instrument and the reflection of her time, a woman who shaped history, even as she was shaped by it. The ease with which she believed became the measure of how fragile humanity's moral balance can be. For every ideology that promises salvation, there is a Magda waiting to serve it. Philosophers began to speak of her as an archetype, the believer at the end of history. In her, they saw the ultimate expression of what happens when devotion becomes detached from doubt. Doubt, they argued, is the soul's last defense against tyranny. When it is silenced, morality ceases to be moral and becomes mechanical. Magda silenced her doubt so completely that even her final act felt, to her, like virtue. She did not think of herself as committing a crime. She thought she was keeping faith. That distinction, so grotesque and yet so human, is what gives her story its endurance. It is not a relic of the past, but a recurring parable about the peril of unquestioned belief. In the archives of her time, the documents that mention her often do so with restraint, as if words themselves hesitate. The witnesses who saw her in those final days in the bunker described her with reverence, even pity. She was like marble, one said, as if already carved for a grave. Another recalled that her voice, when she spoke, carried neither fear nor sadness, only fatigue. Fatigue not of the body, but of the soul, the exhaustion of someone who has carried belief too long. When she spoke of her children's fate, there was no tremor in her tone. "They belong to a better world," she said, and the words fell into the air like a benediction turned poison. No one dared contradict her. They had all been living too long inside the same illusion, the illusion that loyalty could sanctify anything. Even now, when historians read those testimonies, a chill passes through their prose. The bunker, that last theater of the Reich, was filled with figures clinging to fragments of faith, soldiers who still saluted invisible leaders, secretaries who typed orders for armies that no longer existed. But among them, Magda alone moved with the calm of completion. She had reached the logical end of the ideology that had sustained her, a place where mercy no longer mattered because purity had become everything. Her final act was the consummation of a belief system that demanded total sacrifice, and she obeyed with perfect composure. In that obedience lies the most terrifying truth of her life. She did not need to be forced. Over time, her story ceased to belong solely to historians. It migrated into philosophy, art, and even theology. Writers spoke of her as the angel of certainty, a phrase that captured both her beauty and her ruin. Theologians compared her faith to the inverted mysticism of saints, those who seek unity with something larger than themselves, even if it means annihilation. But where saints surrender to love, she surrendered to ideology. In that inversion lies the essence of her tragedy. She mistook authority for divinity, hierarchy for holiness, and obedience for grace. Her entire life was an act of misplaced worship. She believed she was serving God through the Reich, when in truth she was serving the void. In the present day, when her name is spoken at all, it is rarely in anger. The fury that once surrounded her has cooled into contemplation. What remains is a kind of wary respect, not for her actions, but for the magnitude of her delusion. She's become a study in how ordinary virtues can be corrupted, how love of order can slip into tyranny, how tenderness can conceal terror. Her existence is proof that evil does not need chaos to thrive. It can live quite comfortably in elegance, in loyalty, in devotion. The silence she left behind is not the silence of peace, but of recognition, the sound the world makes when it finally admits that what it fears most is already within it. There is a phrase often used by those who walk the grounds above the old bunker. Hier ist nichts zu sehen. There is nothing to see here. It is true and untrue in equal measure. The ground itself has been paved, the soil turned and built upon, yet beneath it lies the residue of belief, the sediment of a world that chose certainty over conscience. To stand there is to feel the faint hum of history underfoot, the heartbeat of a faith that destroyed itself. Perhaps that is Magda's final monument. Not stone, not bronze, but the quiet knowledge that devotion, left unchecked, will always end in silence. And so her story continues, not in words, but in the spaces between them. She remains the whisper behind every new promise of purity, every movement that mistakes unity for virtue. Her life is the echo that reminds us that faith, without the softening presence of mercy, can devour the world. She is the still point in the turning of centuries, the calm at the heart of every storm that believes itself righteous. To remember her is not to absolve her, but to remember what belief can become when it forgets to doubt. When the century turned once more and the survivors of her time were gone, Magda Goebbels remained, uninvited but indelible, in the collective memory of the world. She was no longer a figure of history so much as a parable of faith gone blind, a moral equation that could not be solved but only studied. The scholars who continued to write about her in the 21st century did so with a tone that mixed fascination and dread, as though they were examining a fault line in the human spirit. They no longer asked why she did what she did. They asked instead what in her mirrored us. What dormant instinct in all of humanity responds to the call of devotion dressed as duty? Because even now, in an age that claims to have outgrown idols, the hunger for certainty persists. We still search for something to kneel before, something to surrender to, something that promises meaning in exchange for obedience. Magda had found hers, and it destroyed her. But the need that drove her was not unique to her century. It belongs to the architecture of the human soul. In this way, her story became less about one woman and more about the mechanism of belief itself. The philosophers who returned to her writings found in them not a monster's voice, but the echo of every human heart that has ever sought order through faith. They spoke of her as an emblem of moral inversion, a person who made virtue her vice by following it too far until it turned against life itself. Magda's love was not shallow. It was too deep, so deep that it drowned reason. Her loyalty was not weakness. It was strength misdirected toward destruction. In that reversal lies the essence of her tragedy. The same qualities that make human beings noble, devotion, conviction, the capacity for sacrifice, are the very ones that, when corrupted, make them capable of atrocity. She revealed that the path to hell is not paved with cruelty, but with sincerity. Writers who explored her legacy in the modern age often began by describing the stillness of her last photographs, the elegance of her posture, the faint upward curve of her mouth, the serenity that makes the image unbearable. They compared her to the marble statues of faith that line old cathedrals, their faces carved in perfect calm as if untouched by sin or fear. But in Magda's calm, there is no holiness, only completion. It is the stillness of someone who has already crossed the threshold from doubt to certainty. The world looks at her and sees the danger of that serenity, the deadliness of an untroubled conscience. She is the embodiment of an ancient temptation, the desire to be right, more than to be kind. Modern Germany has learned to live with her as one learns to live with a scar, visible only in certain light, sensitive when touched. She appears in school textbooks as a brief footnote, a cautionary name in the chapters about fanaticism. Students read about her, whisper about her, move on. Yet each generation, when confronted with her story, feels the same cold curiosity. How could a mother do what she did? And when they learn that she did it calmly, even lovingly, the horror becomes more intimate. It forces them to consider that evil does not always come with hatred, that sometimes it comes with gentleness and purpose. Teachers speak her name carefully, as if invoking it too freely might awaken something dormant. She remains the figure that cannot be entirely understood, because understanding her means facing the possibility that her certainty, in some quiet form, survives in us. Elsewhere, her image has drifted beyond Germany into the broader landscape of human reflection. Artists across continents have used her as a symbol of misplaced devotion. In sculpture, she appears faceless, her arms outstretched, as if offering invisible children to an unseen altar. In poetry, her name becomes a metaphor for the point where love ceases to protect and begins to destroy. In these works, she is less a person than an idea, the embodiment of what happens when the will to serve overtakes the will to live. The more time passes, the more she dissolves into abstraction. But abstraction does not erase her. It universalizes her. She becomes the eternal reminder that morality, without compassion, is merely geometry, precise, symmetrical, and dead. Theologians who revisit her story sometimes describe her as the final expression of a faith stripped of transcendence. She had no God, only an idol of perfection that demanded blood instead of grace. In that sense, she was a priestess of a new religion, one that replaced redemption with purity. It was a faith without forgiveness, a creed without mercy. Her devotion was ritualistic, her obedience liturgical. Even her death was performed like a sacrament. And that, perhaps, is what makes her story so modern. It speaks of a world that still confuses morality with conformity, spirituality with control. The centuries change their gods, but the shape of devotion remains the same. When one stands in Berlin today, amid the symmetry of reconstructed buildings and the hum of ordinary life, it is difficult to imagine the fever that once consumed the city. Yet under that calm surface, traces of the past remain, like veins beneath the skin. The air still seems to carry, faintly, the echo of the old march rhythms, the distant ghost of voices raised in faith. It is not nostalgia, but warning that stirs there, a reminder that civilization can rebuild its walls, but not its innocence. The soil beneath the city has absorbed too much certainty to ever be entirely clean. Somewhere under that soil lies the place where Magda's conviction ended and her silence began. It is unmarked, unadorned, as it should be. To mark it would be to risk sanctifying it, and her story demands no shrine. Its lesson lives not in stone but in conscience. And so, in the rhythm of modern life, Her name drifts through the currents of thought and memory, never fully alive, never fully dead. She has become part of the lexicon of human warning, a wordless testament to what happens when faith forgets humility. Her story is retold not to condemn her again, but to keep the world vigilant against its own reflection. Each era has its own Magdas, clothed differently, speaking new languages, yet bound by the same quiet hunger for belonging. They do not shout, they whisper. They are mothers, teachers, believers, citizens, people who mean well, who believe in order, who long for peace so fervently that they cannot see what their peace demands. That is the legacy Magda Goebbels leaves behind, not merely the horror of her final act, but the mirror she holds to the world, showing how conviction, when unexamined, will always lead us back to the abyss. History does not erase such figures. It folds them into its bloodstream, where they continue to circulate unseen, shaping how later generations imagine the boundaries of morality. Magda Goebbels, despite the world's efforts to bury her under the rubble of ideology and shame, endures as one of those figures. She is not remembered because of the scale of her crimes. They were personal, contained, almost domestic, but because her actions reveal something that history is reluctant to face. That devotion, when untethered from doubt, can be more fatal than hatred. In her calm lies the quiet truth of the 20th century, that evil often comes with the face of gentleness. The photographs of her still startle because they refuse to fit the language of villainy. She is not monstrous, she is immaculate. That contradiction is what makes her unerasable. She represents not the alien, but the familiar made unbearable. In the years after Germany's reconstruction, the story of Magda became both taboo and indispensable. The nation's rebirth required faith in its own redemption, and she embodied precisely the kind of faith that could not be redeemed. To study her too closely was to question the safety of virtue itself. Yet she remained necessary, a cautionary presence haunting the moral architecture of the new republic. Teachers, theologians, and historians turned to her not to mourn or condemn, but to define the limits of obedience. Her image appeared not in public memorials, but in the quiet spaces of discourse, a face mentioned in lectures, a sentence quoted in ethics debates, a metaphor whispered in novels about conformity and guilt. She became a boundary marker, the line separating belief from delusion, love from possession. And though the world around her changed, she remained fixed, preserved by the paradox that destroyed her. In the 1980s and 1990s, when global ideologies began once again to fracture, her name surfaced in unexpected places. Political commentators invoked her as an example of how moral absolutism seduces societies in crisis. Psychologists used her to illustrate the phenomenon of cognitive captivity, the way the human mind, seeking meaning, will embrace destruction rather than live in uncertainty. Artists, always drawn to contradiction, began to see her as the embodiment of the 20th century's deepest tension, the coexistence of refinement and barbarity. The films and stage works that portrayed her during those years often avoided direct moral judgment. They sought instead to capture the texture of her faith, the polished surfaces, the quiet rituals, the moments of intimacy that made the horror believable. It was as though the artists understood that to portray her as monstrous would be to let the world too easily off the hook. Her story was also rediscovered by women writers who saw in her not an idol or victim, but a distorted reflection of their own inheritance. They wrote of her as the shadow of obedience that every generation of women must confront, the voice that whispers that virtue lies in silence, that devotion is love, that loyalty is holiness. They understood her as a cautionary ancestor, not of Nazism, but of submission itself. These retellings did not seek sympathy. They sought exorcism. Through her, they examined how easily the social virtues assigned to women, grace, sacrifice, faith, could be turned into instruments of destruction when claimed by power. In Magda, they found both the seed and the culmination of the ideal that had long bound women to history's cruelties. She was not its author, but its apotheosis. Theological thinkers, too, returned to her story as the 20th century drew to a close. For them, Magda represented the collapse of transcendence, the moment when human belief, cut off from mercy, turns divine hunger into idolatry. They called her the last mystic of the secular age, a phrase that sounds paradoxical but captures her essence. Like a saint without God, she sought purity through annihilation, believing that her devotion justified every act. The bunker became her chapel, the Führer her idol, the deaths of her children her offering. It was blasphemy disguised as faith, and in that disguise she found peace. This reading of her life transformed her from a historical figure into a symbol of what happens when the sacred is replaced by ideology, when the heart confuses power with salvation. Outside the world of scholarship, her name faded and resurfaced in rhythm with the times. During moments of political unrest, journalists invoked her again, comparing her serenity to the faces of new believers who would sacrifice others and themselves for their chosen causes. During periods of complacency, she vanished once more into the background, her story too heavy for a generation busy with progress. Yet the silence never lasted long. Whenever humanity drifted again towards certainty, her ghost stirred, reminding it what certainty costs. The air itself seemed to recall her lesson, that the desire to be pure is the most dangerous desire of all. By the beginning of the new millennium, the physical remnants of her world had almost entirely disappeared. The bunker lay sealed beneath concrete and gravel, the villa on the lake had been repurposed, and even the graves of her extended family were unmarked or lost. Only the photographs remained, endlessly reproduced, each one a frozen argument between beauty and horror. Scholars continued to debate whether she deserved empathy or only eternal reproach, but the debate itself proved her endurance. People do not argue about the forgotten. She survived not because the world forgave her, but because it could not stop recognizing itself in her reflection. She is the reminder that progress does not erase the potential for blindness. It merely changes its vocabulary. There is something unsettling in the way her name resists finality. Every attempt to close her story seems to open it again. Each explanation leads to another question, each condemnation to another hesitation. It is as if her life exists not in time, but in recurrence, resurfacing whenever the world begins to worship its own ideals. In that sense, she's become less a figure of the past than an ever-present warning, a moral echo reverberating through history's corridors. She is the proof that the capacity for self-destruction is built into the architecture of faith, that the longing to believe, if left untempered, can make even tenderness lethal. Somewhere, perhaps, that is her true immortality, not in legend, not in infamy, but in repetition. Each time a society kneels before its own reflection and calls it truth, each time love is measured by obedience, each time purity is valued more than mercy, her story begins again. The names and symbols change, the flags and prayers evolve, but the essence remains. The human need to believe in something unbroken, even if it must break us to find it. Magda Goebbels, serene in the face of ruin, remains history's mirror of that impulse, the calm believer standing at the edge of reason, certain that devotion is salvation. And perhaps that is why, even now, she cannot rest. She is not finished because we are not. Time has the strange habit of forgiving what it cannot understand. As the 21st century deepened, Magda Goebbels slipped further from the realm of outrage and closer to that of unease, a figure too quiet to demonize, too lucid to pity, too familiar to forget. The anger that once surrounded her story gave way to contemplation, a slow recognition that what she embodied was not a monstrous exception, but a recurring flaw in the human design. The more the world advanced, the more her tragedy began to resemble a mirror held up to the age of certainty that was returning in new forms. For though the languages of devotion had changed, the hunger for it remained. People still longed for clarity, for systems that promised belonging, for causes that removed the burden of thought. In this sense, Magda Goebbels had outlived her century. She had become an ancestor of every generation that sought meaning through obedience. Writers continued to return to her as though drawn by a gravity that even they could not resist. Her name appeared in essays about fanaticism, in novels about motherhood, in reflections on the moral fragility of civilization. Some treated her story as allegory, others approached it as an open wound. But the pattern was always the same: curiosity followed by revulsion, judgment followed by recognition. To study her is to walk a narrow path where condemnation feels safe, but comprehension feels dangerous. Because to understand her is to admit that faith, loyalty, and love, the very qualities that define our humanity, can be turned against life itself. She stands as the embodiment of a paradox that no society has yet resolved, that the virtues that sustain civilization can also destroy it when pursued without humility. The 20th century had ended, yet its ghosts walked through the new millennium with surprising ease. Old ideologies had died, but new ones bloomed under different banners, promising unity, purity, and rebirth. And once again, people gathered around these promises with the same trembling devotion that had once filled stadiums and cathedrals. The scholars who wrote about Magda began to see her not as a historical relic, but as a modern prophecy. They called her the face of belief without question, a reflection of the enduring human instinct to trade conscience for comfort. Her story was no longer about Germany, nor even about war. It was about the fragile balance between moral clarity and moral blindness that continues to define every age. The language of her time, the words purity, destiny, sacrifice, had been discredited, yet the ideas beneath them survived. They resurfaced in softer tones, dressed in the rhetoric of virtue, progress, and protection. And still, somewhere within those new vocabularies, the echo of her faith could be heard. The same yearning for order, for a world purified of contradiction, for the simplicity of belonging to something greater than oneself. It was the same yearning that had guided her hand in the bunker when she believed that death was mercy. Her century had merely translated her delusion into new dialects. The symbols changed, the desire remained. Artists who depicted her in later years no longer tried to explain her. They simply observed. In film and theater, she was portrayed as a figure of stillness amid chaos, a woman whose composure was both terrifying and magnetic. The audience watched her and felt a kind of vertigo, a moral dizziness in the face of her certainty. There was no catharsis, no release, only the slow realization that her serenity was the mirror image of their own need to believe in control. The performances always ended in silence because there are no words that can reconcile love and destruction once they have merged. That silence, more than anything, became her legacy. Theologists, psychologists, and philosophers converged around her as though she were a riddle designed to test the limits of understanding. Some described her as the perfect vessel of ideological possession, a person emptied of self until only belief remained. Others saw in her an inverted saint, a mystic who sought transcendence through purity rather than compassion. A few, more provocatively, argued that she represented not faith's corruption, but its purest form, the total surrender of self to the idea of meaning. For them, her story was not the opposite of religion, but its dark twin. the point where devotion becomes indistinguishable from annihilation. These readings disturbed as much as they clarified. They reminded the modern mind that the capacity for absolute belief had not vanished with her death. It had simply migrated into subtler spaces. Politics, technology, identity, progress, all the new gods that promised salvation through certainty. Berlin, rebuilt and luminous, seemed to embody the triumph of remembrance over ruin. Yet even there, her presence lingered invisibly, a pulse beneath the city's glass and stone. On certain days when the wind shifted across the river, one could feel the weight of what lay beneath. The buried chambers, the unspoken prayers, the thin boundary between past and present. The city had turned her resting place into an absence, an unmarked void in its geography. But absence is its own kind of monument. It demands no visitors, only awareness. Those who know where to look sometimes stop at that quiet patch of ground, listening not for ghosts, but for silence itself, the silence she left as her final sermon. That silence remains her truest legacy. It cannot be codified, only felt. The silence of belief carried to its end. The silence after ideology exhausts its language. It is the stillness that follows every era of conviction, when the fires of righteousness burn out, and humanity must again learn to live without certainty. In that silence, one can almost hear her voice, not speaking, not pleading, simply present. It is the sound of faith stripped of hope, of devotion stripped of mercy. It is the warning that all ages inherit, that to be human is to believe, but to remain human is to doubt. As generations pass, the story of Magda Goebbels becomes less about the woman herself and more about the fragility she revealed in us all. Her life is a study in how ideals, left unchecked, consume the very lives they were meant to elevate. She stands as the quiet embodiment of humanity's oldest temptation, the longing to escape the burden of freedom by surrendering it to an authority that promises peace. That longing has worn many names throughout history, and it will wear many more. But behind each of them, if one listens closely enough, one can still hear her breathing softly in the background, the calm voice of conviction whispering that obedience is love, that order is truth, that sacrifice is purity. It is that whisper the world must continue to resist, not with anger, but with remembrance. And so she endures, not as an idol or a villain, but as the permanent question left in the heart of modernity. Her life and death belong to the same pattern that continues to repeat whenever certainty grows louder than compassion. She is the stillness before the next storm, the calm face of belief before it turns to fire. History, it seems, has not finished speaking through her. It never will, as long as faith remains part of what makes us human. There is a point at which remembrance ceases to be about the past and becomes a form of vigilance. Magda Goebbels exists there, in that narrow space where history transforms into warning. She no longer belongs to Germany, nor to the war that consumed her. She belongs to the perpetual struggle within the human heart between belief and conscience, between the desire for purity and the acceptance of imperfection. Every age rediscovers her, not out of fascination but necessity, because her story is the measure of how easily the light of conviction can flicker into darkness. Her calm, her poise, her serenity, they were the outward grace of inward blindness. She reminds the world that evil, when it speaks softly enough, can sound like moral clarity. And this is why she remains, a quiet thread woven through the moral fabric of modern civilization, invisible but unbreakable. As the century matured into one defined by information and fragmentation, her image acquired a new kind of relevance. The new world was not ruled by banners or parades, but by screens, networks, and invisible ideologies that promised meaning with equal fervor. Truth was no longer dictated from pulpits or podiums, but by algorithms that mirrored human desire. Yet even here, the same longing persisted, the yearning for order, for narratives without contradiction, for certainties that could absolve the anxiety of freedom. In this world, Magda's reflection reappeared not in uniforms or speeches, but in the serenity of conviction that glowed from every new orthodoxy. Her tragedy was no longer distant. It had evolved with the times. She had become the archetype of belief in its most seductive form, belief that demands surrender rather than thought. Historians continued to write about her, but their tone grew more reflective, more philosophical. The anger that once accompanied her name had cooled into something quieter, almost mournful. They no longer sought to assign guilt. Her guilt was absolute, but to understand the mechanism by which ordinary virtue had turned into catastrophe. They wrote of her as one writes about a natural force, inevitable and incomprehensible, a convergence of psychology, culture, and faith that could not have ended otherwise. Some even described her as a kind of moral equation, one that demonstrated how every civilization contains within it the potential for its own undoing. In her, they saw the unity of opposites, tenderness and tyranny, motherhood and murder, grace and fanaticism. She had fused these contradictions into a single, fatal harmony. Writers, too, found themselves returning to her in moments of doubt about their own age. They saw in her story the reflection of their era's illusions, the belief that technology, ideology, or moral progress could purify the world of suffering. Her life, they argued, was proof that the pursuit of purity is the most dangerous form of desire. For purity can tolerate no imperfection, and human beings are made of imperfection. Once that truth is forgotten, compassion collapses, and order becomes cruelty disguised as virtue. Magda Goebbels remains the exemplar of that collapse, her calm smile the eternal face of the moment when faith turns against life. Theologians, unwilling to let her vanish into abstraction, continued to wrestle with her meaning. They called her the last believer of the old world, a woman who had replaced divinity with ideology but retained the form of prayer. In her rituals of loyalty, her worship of authority, her sacrificial logic, they recognized a distorted echo of religion itself. She was what happens when reverence loses its object but not its hunger. To them, her story was not the death of faith, but its mutation, a warning that when humanity ceases to worship compassion, it will worship power instead. And in this light, her devotion was less an anomaly than an inevitability, the shadow side of faith itself. Meanwhile, Berlin continued to breathe above her unmarked grave. The city had learned how to coexist with its ghosts, how to walk through its ruins without tripping on them, how to remember without reopening wounds. Yet every so often someone would pause near the patch of ground that once covered the bunker, aware of the stillness beneath. The air there carries a faint heaviness, not of grief but of memory condensed. Beneath the traffic and chatter, one can almost sense the pulse of a vanished world, a world built on obedience, destroyed by its own perfection. It lies dormant, not as menace, but as reminder, as if the earth itself remembers that it once bore witness to the moment when faith consumed love. The world beyond that ground changes endlessly, yet the moral landscape remains the same. Every new ideology begins with the promise of harmony. Every generation believes it has transcended the mistakes of the past. And then, inevitably, comes the return of certainty, the tranquil conviction that one's own values are pure, one's own truth absolute. It begins quietly, dressed in reason, spoken in soft voices. It grows in the name of peace, safety, morality, and somewhere always the face of Magda Goebbels flickers back into focus. That composure, that luminous calm that mistakes destruction for devotion. Her story does not accuse, it forewarns. She is the eternal caution against the human temptation to seek redemption through obedience rather than through mercy. Perhaps this is why, despite the centuries that will pass, her name will never quite disappear. She is not a ghost of the past, but a presence in every era that forgets to question itself. Her legacy is not carved in stone, but written in the rhythm of human history, a pattern that repeats whenever faith becomes infallible. She reminds us that progress cannot protect us from ourselves, that enlightenment does not erase the impulse to worship power, only disguises it. Her calm remains, serene and terrible, the image of what happens when love of order eclipses love of life. And so, the story of Magda Goebbels ends where it began, with a woman gazing at a symbol and mistaking its symmetry for peace. The cross on her childhood wall, the flag she adored, the leader she served, the children she loved, all were reflections of the same hunger, the desire for something unbroken in a broken world. That hunger still moves within us. It builds nations and destroys them, heals and corrupts, saves and condemns. To remember her is not to keep the past alive, but to recognize that its seed still grows in the soil of the present. Her silence endures not as peace, but as question. And if one night the world grows too quiet, if the noise of conviction fades long enough for reflection to speak, we might still hear her voice, not pleading, not defiant, but calm as ever, asking whether belief without doubt can ever be human.